Section 24 of Bismarck and the Foundation of the German Empire by James Headlam. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by S.S. Kim, Seoul, South Korea. Chapter 14. The War with France and Foundation of the Empire, from 1870 to 1871. Part 2. The negotiations with the provisional government were more than once renewed. Soon after the investiture of Paris had begun, General Burnside and another American passed as unofficial messengers between the French and German governments, and at the beginning of November, Thiers came as the official agent of the government in Tours. These attempts were, however, always without result. The French would not accept an armistice on the only conditions which Bismarck was authorized by the king and the military authorities to offer. During the rest of the year, there was little direct communication with the French authorities. Bismarck, however, was not idle. In his quarters at Versailles, he had with him many of the Foreign Office staff. He had not only to conduct important diplomatic negotiations, but also to maintain control over the nation, to keep in touch with the press, to communicate to the newspapers both events and comments on them. At this crisis, he could not leave public opinion without proper direction. He had to combat the misstatements of the French, who had long had the ear of Europe, and were still carrying their grievances to the courts of the neutral powers, and found often eager advocates in the press of the neutral countries. He had to check the proposal of the neutral powers to interfere between the two combatants, to inform the German public of the demands that were to be made on France and the proposals for the unity of the country, and to justify the policy of the government. All this was done not only by official notes, but by articles written at his dictation or under his instruction, and by information or suggestions conveyed by his secretaries to his newspapers. In old days, the Prussian government had been inarticulate. It had never been able to defend itself against the attacks of foreign critics. It had suffered much by misrepresentation. It had lost popularity at home and prestige abroad. In the former struggles with France, the voice of Germany had scarcely been heard. Europe, which was accustomed to listen to every whisper from Paris, ignored the feelings and the just grievances of Germany. Bismarck changed all this. Now he saw to it that the policy of the government should be explained and defended in Germany itself. For though he despised public opinion when it claimed to be the canon by which the government should be directed, he never neglected this, as he never neglected any means by which the government might be strengthened. Speaking now from Versailles, he could be confident that Europe would listen to what Germany said, and it was no small benefit to his nation that it had as its spokesman a man whose character and abilities ensured that no word that he uttered would be neglected. The neutral powers really gave him little concern. There was no intention of supporting France either in England, Russia, or Austria. He showed great activity, however, in defending the Germans from the charges so freely made against them by the French press, of conducting the war in cruel manner, charges which were untrue, for according to the unanimous testimony of foreign observers who accompanied the army, the moderation of the German soldiers was as remarkable as their successes. Bismarck was not content with rebutting unjust accusations. He carried on the war into the enemy's camp. He was especially indignant at the misuse made by the French of irregular troops. He often maintained that the German soldiers ought never to imprison the Franc-tireurs, but shoot them at once. He feared that if civilians were encouraged to take part in the war, it would necessarily assume a very cruel character. At Mons, he came upon a number of Franc-tireurs who had been taken prisoners. "You are assassins, gentlemen," he said to them. "You will all be hung." And indeed, these men who fired secretly on the German troops from behind hedges and in the forests, and had no kind of uniform, could not claim to be treated as prisoners of war. When the bombardment of Paris began, he took great pains to defend the measure, which was much attacked in other countries. He had used all his influence that the bombardment should not be delayed, and often spoke with great annoyance of the reluctance of the military authorities to begin. He wished every measure to be taken which would bring the war to an end as soon as possible. The long delay before Paris seems to have affected his nerves and spirits. There were many anxious hours, and it was always difficult for him to wait patiently the result of what others were doing. The military authorities were, as always, very jealous of all attempts by him to interfere in their department, and he was not always satisfied with their decisions. Like all the Germans, he was surprised and angry at the unexpected resistance of Paris, and the success of Gambetta's appeal to the nation. He was especially indignant at the help which Garibaldi gave. "This," he said, "is the gratitude of the Italians." He declared that he would have the general taken prisoner and paraded through the streets of Berlin. During the long weeks at Versailles, Bismarck was much occupied with German affairs. The victory of Sedan was the foundation of German unity. Bismarck's moderation and reserve now earned its reward. He had always refused to press the Southern states into the Federation. Now the offer to join came from them. Baden asked, as she already done at the beginning of the year, to be received into the Union. The settlement with Württemberg, and above all with Bavaria, was less simple. At the request of the Bavarian government, Delbrück was sent to Munich for an interchange of opinion, and the negotiations which were begun there were afterwards continued at Versailles and Berlin. There were many difficulties to be overcome. The Bavarians were very jealous of their independence and were not prepared to put themselves into the position which, for instance, Saxony occupied. But the difficulties on the Prussian side were equally great. The Liberal Party wished that the constitution should be revised and those points in it which they had always disliked altered. They would have made the government of the federal authorities more direct, have created a federal ministry and the federal upper house, and so really changed the federation into a simple state, thereby taking away all the independence of the dynasties. It was quite certain that Bavaria would not accept this, and there was some considerable danger that their exaggerated demands might lead to a reaction in South Germany. Probably under any circumstances, the unification of Germany would have been completed, but it required all Bismarck's tact to prevent outbreak of a regular party struggle. The most extreme line was taken by the Crown Prince of Prussia. He desired the immediate creation of an emperor who should have sovereign authority over the whole of Germany, and he even went so far as to suggest that if the Bavarians would not accept this voluntarily, they might be compelled to do so. He had repeated conversation with Bismarck on this, and on one occasion at least it ended in an angry scene. The Crown Prince wished to threaten the South Germans. "There is no danger," he said. "Let us take a firm and commanding attitude. You will see I was right in maintaining that you are not nearly sufficiently conscious of your own power." It is almost incredible that he should have used such language, but the evidence is conclusive. He was at this time commanding the Bavarian troops against the French. Bavaria had with great loyalty supported Prussia through the war and performed very valuable services, and now he proposed to reward their friendship by compelling them to accept terms by which the independence of the king and the very existence of the state would be endangered. The last request which the King of Bavaria had sent to the Crown Prince as he left Munich to take command of the Bavarian army was that nothing might be done to interfere with Bavarian independence. Of course, Bismarck refused to listen to these suggestions. Had he done so, the probable result would have been that the Bavarian army would have been withdrawn from France, and then all the result of the victories would have been lost. What Bismarck did was in accordance with his usual practice to make no greater alteration in existing institution than was absolutely necessary. He did not, therefore, undertake any reform of the federal constitution, but simply proposed treaties by which the southern states, each separately, entered into the existing alliance. Certain special conditions were allowed. The King of Bavaria was to maintain the command over his troops in time of peace. A voice was given to Bavaria in the management of foreign affairs. She retained her own post and telegraph, and there were certain special privileges with regard to finance to meet the system of taxation on beer. And then the Prussian military code was not to apply to Bavaria, and Bavaria was to retain her own special laws with regard to marriage and citizenship. These concessions were undoubtedly very considerable, but Bismarck granted them, for, as he said to the Bavarian envoys, "We do not want a discontented Bavaria. We want one which will join us freely." The liberal publicists in Germany, with characteristic intolerance, complained that when they hoped to see the constitution made simpler and the central government stronger, it had really become more federal. They did not see that this federalism was merely the expression of existing facts which could not be ignored. They prophesied all kinds of difficulties which have not been fulfilled, for they forgot that harmonious working in an alliance voluntarily made would be a firmer bond of union than the most stringent articles of treaties which were looked on as an unjust burden. Bismarck's own words, spoken the evening after the agreement was signed, give the true account of the matter. The newspapers will not be satisfied. The historian may very likely condemn our conventions. He may say, the stupid fellow might easily have asked for more. He would have got it. They would have had to give it him. His might was his right. I was more anxious that these people should go away heartily satisfied. What is the use of treaties when men are forced to sign? I know that they went away satisfied. I do not wish to press them or to take full advantage of the situation. The convention has its defects, but it is all the stronger on account of them. He could afford now to be generous, because in 1866 he had been so stern. He had refused to take in Bavaria when it would have weakened the association of the North. Now that the nucleus had been formed, he could allow the Catholic South greater freedom. He was right. The concession granted to Bavaria have not been in any way a danger to the empire. As soon as he had signed the convention, he looked into the room where his secretaries were and said, The work is done. The unity of Germany is completed, and with it Kaiser and Reich. Up to this time, he had taken no open steps towards the proclamation of the empire. But it was unanimously demanded by almost the whole nation, and especially by the South Germans. But here he kept himself in the background. He refused to make it appear as though he were to make the emperor or found the empire. He allowed the natural wish of the people to work itself out spontaneously. There was indeed some reluctance to assume the title at the Prussian court. The king himself was not anxious for a new dignity which would obscure the title which he and his ancestors had made so honorable. This feeling was shared by many of the nobility and the officers. We find it strongest in Horn, who in this represents the genuine feeling of the older Prussian nobility. They disliked the change, which must mean that the Prussia to which they were so devotedly attached was to become merged in a greater Germany. There was also some apprehension that with the new title, the old traditions of the Prussian court, traditions of economy, almost of parsimony, might be forgotten, and that a new career might begin in which they would attempt to imitate the extravagance and pomp of less prudent sovereigns. With this perhaps Bismarck himself had some sympathy. The king would of course only assume the new title if it was offered to him by his fellow princes. There was some danger lest the Reichstag, which had been summoned to ratify the treaties, might ask him to assume it before the princes did. Had they done so, he would probably have refused. The Crown Prince, who was very eager for the new title, and the Grand Duke of Baden used all their influence with their fellow princes. The initiative must come from the King of Bavaria. He was in difficulty as to the form in which the offer should be made. Bismarck, who throughout the whole negotiations worked behind the scenes, smoothing away difficulties, thereupon drafted a letter which he sent by special messenger to the King of Bavaria. The king at once adopted it, copied it out and signed it, and at the same time wrote another letter to the other princes, asking them to join in the request which he had made to the King of Prussia to assume the title of Emperor, which had been in abeyance for over 60 years. So it came about that the letter by which the offer to the king was made had really emanated from his own chancellor. It shows to what good purpose Bismarck used the confidence which, by his conduct in the previous negotiations, the King of Bavaria had been led to place in him. On the 18th of January 1871, in the Palace of Versailles, the king publicly assumed the new title. A few days later, Bismarck was raised to the rank of prince. A few days later, Paris fell. The prolonged siege was over, and the power of resistance exhausted. Then again, as 3 months before, Favre asked for an audience, this time to negotiate the capitulation of the city. We need not here dwell on the terms of the capitulation. We need only quote what Favre himself says of Bismarck's attitude. I should be unfaithful to truth if I did not recognize that in these mournful discussions I always found the Chancellor eager to soften in form the cruelty of his requirements. He applied himself as much as was possible to temper the military harshness of the General Staff, and on many points he consented to make himself the advocate of our demands. A few weeks were allowed for elections to be held and an assembly to meet at Bordeaux. And then once more, Monsieur Thiers appeared to negotiate the terms of peace. He knew that the demands would be very heavy. He anticipated that they would be asked to surrender Alsace, including Belfort, and of Lorraine, at least the department of the Moselle, with Metz. He expected a large war indemnity, 5,000 million francs. The terms Bismarck had to offer were almost identical with this, except that the indemnity was placed at 6,000 million francs. The part Thiers had to play was a very difficult one. He knew that if Germany insisted on her full demands, he must accept. He was too experienced a politician to be misled by any of the illusions under which Favre had labored. He, as all other Frenchmen, had during the last 3 months learned a bitter lesson. Had we made peace, he said, before the fall of Metz, we might at least have saved Lorraine. He hoped against hope that he might still be able to do so. With all the resources of his intellect and his eloquence, he tried to break down the opposition of the Count. When Metz was refused to him, then he pleaded for Belfort. Let us hear what Favre, who was present at the decisive interview, tells us. We may use his authority with more confidence than he was a silent and passive auditor. One must have been present at this pathetic scene to have an idea of the superhuman resources which the illustrious statesman displayed. I still see him, pale, agitated, now sitting, now springing to his feet. I hear his voice broken by grief, his words cut short, his tones in turn suppliant and proud. I know nothing grander than the sublime passion of this noble heart bursting out in petitions, menaces, prayers, now caressing, now terrible, growing by degrees more angry in face of this cruel refusal, ready for the last extremities, impervious to the counsel of reason, so violent and sacred were the sentiments by which he was governed. Bismarck remained obdurate. He would surrender neither Metz nor Belfort. Then Thiers cried out, "Well, let it be as you will. These negotiations are a pretense. We appear to deliberate. We have only to pass under your yoke. We ask for a city absolutely French. You refuse it to us. It is to avow that you have resolved to wage against us a war of extremity. Do it. Ravish our provinces, burn our houses, cut the throats of their unoffending inhabitants. In a word, complete your work. We will fight to the last breath. We will succumb at last, but we will not be dishonored." It was a burst of passion, all the more admirable that Thiers knew his threats were vain. But it was not ineffective. Bismarck was troubled. He said he understood what they suffered. He would be glad to make a concession. But, he added, I can promise nothing. The king has commanded me to maintain the conditions. He alone has the right to modify them. I will take his orders. I must consult with Monsieur de Moltke. It was nearly an hour before he could find Moltke. Then he returned to give the answer to the Frenchman. You had refused that we should enter Paris. If you will agree that the German troops occupy Paris, then Belfort shall be restored to you. There could be no doubt as to the answer, and some hours later the assent of the king was given to this alteration in the conditions. Before this, the indemnity had been reduced to 5,000 million francs. Below that, all the efforts of the French were not able to bring it. There were many other exciting scenes during the progress of the negotiations. On one occasion, Thiers threatened Bismarck with interposition of the neutral powers. If you speak to me of Europe, I'll speak of the Emperor, was Bismarck's answer. He threatened to open negotiations with him and to send him back to France at the head of Bazaine's army. On another occasion, it was during the discussion of finance, another scene took place which Favre describes. As the discussion continued, he grew animated. He interrupted Thiers at every word, accused him of wishing to spoil everything. He said that he was ill, at the end of his powers. He was incapable of going further in a work that we were pleased to make of no use. Then, allowing his feelings to break out, walking up and down the little room in which we were deliberating, with great strides, he cried, "It is very kind of me to take the trouble to which you condemn me. Our conditions are ultimatums. You must accept or reject them. I will not take part in it any longer. Bring an interpreter tomorrow. Henceforward, I will not speak French any longer." And he began forthwith to talk German at a great rate, a language which of course neither of the Frenchmen understood. It is interesting to compare with this Bismarck's own account of the same scene. When I addressed a definite demand to Thiers, although he generally could command himself, he sprang up and cried, "Mais c'est en indignité." I took no notice but began to talk German. For a time he listened, but obviously did not know what to think of it. Then, in a plaintive voice, he said, "But Count, you know that I do not understand German." I answered him now in French. "When just now you spoke of indignité, I found that I did not understand French enough and preferred to speak German. Here I know what I say and hear." He understood what I meant and at once agreed to that which he had just refused as an indignité. Bismarck's part in these negotiations was not altogether an easy one, for it is probable that, in part at least, he secretly sympathized with the arguments and protests of the French. He was far too loyal to his master and his country not to defend and adopt the policy which had been accepted. But there is much reason to believe that had he been completely master, Germany would not have insisted on having Metz, but would have made the demand only to withdraw it. The arguments for the annexation of Alsace were indeed unanswerable, and again, Bismarck had pointed out that Germany could never be safe so long as France held Strasbourg, and the French army supported on the strong basis of the Vosges could use Strasbourg as a gate whence to sally forth into Germany. No one indeed who has ever stood on the slopes of the Black Forest and looked across the magnificent valley, sheltered by the hills on either side, through which the Rhine flows, can doubt that this is all one country, and that the frontier must be sought, not in the river, which is not a separation, but a cheap means of communication, but on the top of the hills on the further side. Every argument, however, which is used to support German claims to Strasbourg may be used with equal force to support French claims to Metz. If Strasbourg in French hands is the gate of Germany, Metz in German hands is, and always will remain, a military post on the soil of France. No one who reads Bismarck's argument on this point can fail to notice how they are all nearly conclusive as to Strasbourg, but that he scarcely takes the trouble to make it even appear as though they apply to Metz. Even in the speech before the Reichstag, in which he explains and justifies the terms of peace, he speaks again and again of Strasbourg, but hardly a word of Metz. He told how 14 years before, the old king of Württemberg had said to him, at the time of the Crimean trouble, that Prussia might count on his voice in the Diet as against the Western powers, but only till war broke out. Then the matter takes another form. I am determined as well as any other to maintain the engagement I have entered into, but do not judge me unjustly. Give us Strasbourg, and we shall be ready for all eventualities. But so long as Strasbourg is a sally port for a power which is always armed, I must fear that my country will be overrun by foreign troops before my confederates can come to my help. The king was right. Germany would never be secure so long as Strasbourg was French. But can France ever be secure so long as Metz is German? The demand for Metz was based purely on military considerations. It was supported on the theory, which we have already learned, that Germany could never take the offensive in a war with France, and that the possession of Metz would make it impossible, as indeed is the case, for France to attack Germany. It was not, however, Bismarck's practice to subordinate political considerations to military. It may be said that France would never acquiesce in the loss of either province, but while we can imagine a generation of Frenchmen arising who would learn to recognize the watersheds of the Vosges as a permanent boundary between the two nations, it is difficult to believe that the time will ever come when a single Frenchman will regard with contentment the presence of the Germans on the upper Moselle. Even after the preliminaries of peace were settled, fresh difficulties arose. The outbreak of the Commune in Paris made it impossible for the French to fulfill the arrangements. Bismarck, who did not trust the French, treated them with much severity, and more than once he threatened again to begin hostilities. At last, Favre asked for a fresh interview. The two statesmen met at Frankfurt, and then the final treaty of peace was signed. End of section 24. Section 25 of Bismarck and the Foundation of the German Empire by James Headlam. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by S.S. Kim, Seoul, South Korea. Chapter 15. The New Empire, 1871 to 1878. Part 1. With the Peace of Frankfurt, Bismarck's work was completed. Not 9 years had passed since he had become minister. In that short time, he completed the work which so many statesmen before him had in vain attempted. 9 years ago, he had found the king ready to retire from the throne. Now he had made him the most powerful ruler in Europe. Prussia, which then had been divided in itself and without influence in the councils of Europe, was the undisputed leader in a united Germany. Fate, which always was so kind to Bismarck, was not to snatch him away, as it did Carver in the hour of his triumph. 20 years longer he was to preside over the state which he had created and to guide the course of the ship which he had built. A weaker or more timid man would quickly have retired from public life. He would have considered that nothing that he could do could add to his fame, and that he was always risking the loss of some of the reputation he had attained. Bismarck was not influenced by such motives. The exercise of power had become to him a pleasure. He was prepared if his king required it to continue in office to the end of his days, and he never feared to hazard fame and popularity if he could thereby add to the prosperity of the state. These latter years of Bismarck's life we cannot narrate in detail. Space alone would forbid it. It would be to write the history of the German Empire, and though events are not so dramatic, they are no less numerous than in the earlier period. Moreover, we have not the material for a complete biographical narrative. There is indeed a great abundance of public records, but as to the secret reasons of state by which, in the last resort, the policy of the government was determined, we have little knowledge. From time to time, indeed, some illicit disclosure, The publication of some confidential documents throws an unexpected light on a situation which is obscure. But these disclosures, so hazardous to the good repute of the men who are responsible and the country in which they are possible, must be treated with great reserve. Prompted by motives of private revenge or public ambition, they disclose only half the truth, and a portion of the truth is often more misleading than complete ignorance. In foreign policy, he was henceforward sole, undisputed master. In Parliament and in the press, scarcely a voice was raised to challenge his preeminence. He enjoyed the complete confidence of the allied sovereigns and the enthusiastic affection of the nation. Even those parties which often opposed and criticized his internal policy supported him always on foreign affairs. Those only opposed him who were hostile to the empire itself, those whose ideals or interests were injured by this great military monarchy, Poles and ultramontanes, Guelphs and socialists. In opposing Bismarck, they seemed to be traitors to their country, and he and his supporters were not slow to divide the nation into the loyal and the reichsfeindlich. He deserved the confidence which was placed in him. He succeeded in preserving to the newly founded empire all the prestige it had gained. He was enabled to soothe the jealousy of the neutral powers. He did so by his policy of peace. Now, he pursued peace with the same decision with which, but 2 years before, he had brought about war. He was guided by the same motive. As war had then been for the benefit of Germany, so now was peace. He had never loved war for the sake of war. He was too good a diplomatist for this. War is the negotiation of diplomacy, and the statesman who had recourse to it must for the time give over the control to other hands. It is always a clumsy method. The love of war for the sake of war will be found more commonly among autocratic sovereigns who are their own generals than among skilled and practiced ministers, and generally war is the last resource by which a weak diplomatist attempts to conceal his blunders and to regain what he has lost. There had been much anxiety in Europe how the new empire would deport itself. Would it use this power, which had been so irresistible, for fresh conflicts? The excuse might easily have been found. Bismarck might have put on his banner the union of all Germans in one state. He might have recalled and reawakened the enthusiasm of 50 years ago. He might have reminded the people that there were still in Holland and in Switzerland, in Austria and in Russia, Germans who were separated from their country and languishing under a foreign rule. Had he been an idealist, he would have done so and raised in Germany a cry like that of the Italian irredentists. Or he might have claimed for his country its natural boundaries. After freeing the upper waters of the Rhine from foreign dominion, he might have claimed that the great river should flow to the sea, German. This is what French had done under similar circumstances, but he was not the man to repeat the crimes and blunders of Louis and Napoleon. He knew that Germany desired peace. A new generation must grow up in the new order of things. The old wounds must be healed by time, the old divisions forgotten. Long years of common work must cement the alliances that he had made, till the jealousy of the defeated was appeased, and the new empire had become as firm and indissoluble as any other state in Europe. The chief danger came from France. In that unhappy country, the cry for revenge seemed the only link with the pride which had been so rudely overthrown. The defeat and the disgrace could not be forgotten. The recovery of the lost provinces was the desire of the nation and the program of every party. As we have seen, the German statesmen had foreseen the danger and deliberately defied it. They cared not for the hostility of France, now that they need not fear her power. Ordering dum metuant. Against French demands for restitution, they presented a firm and unchangeable negative. It was kinder so and juster to allow no opening for hope, no loophole for negotiation, no intervention by other powers. Alsace-Lorraine were German by the right of the 100,000 German soldiers who had perished to conquer them. Any appearance of weakness would have led to hopes which could never be realized, discussions which could have had no result. The answer to all suggestions was to be found in the strength of Germany. The only diplomacy was to make the army so strong that no French statesman, not even the mob of Paris, could dream of undertaking single-handed a war of revenge. This was not enough. It was necessary besides to isolate France. There were many men in Europe who would have wished to bring about a new coalition of the armies by whose defeat Germany had been built up, France and Austria, Denmark and the Poles. Then it was always to be expected that Russia, who had done so much for Germany in the past, would cease to regard with complacency the success of her protégé. After all, the influence of the Tsar in Europe had depended upon the divisions of Germany as much as had that of France. How soon would the Russian nation wake up, as the French had done, to the fact that the sympathies of their emperor had created a great barrier to Russian ambition and Russian diplomacy? It was especially the clerical party who wished to bring about some coalition. For them, the chief object was the overthrow of Italy, and the world still seemed to center in Rome. They could not gain the assistance of Germany in this work, and they therefore looked on the great Protestant empire as an enemy. They would have liked, by monarchical reaction, to gain control of France, by the success of the Carlist movement to obtain that of France, and then assisted by Austria to overthrow the new order in Europe. Against this, Bismarck's chief energies were directed. We shall see how he fought the ultramontanes at home. With regard to France, he was inclined to support the Republic, and refused all attempts which were made by some German statesmen, and especially by Count Arnim, the ambassador at Paris, to win German sympathy and support to the monarchical party. In Spain, his support and sympathy were given to the government, which with difficulty maintained itself against the Carlists. A visit of Victor Emmanuel to Berlin confirmed the friendship with Italy, of which the action of Garibaldi in 1870 had thrown a cloud. The greatest triumph of Bismarck's policy was, however, the reconciliation with Austria. One of the most intimate of his counselors, when asked which of Bismarck's actions he admired most, specified this. It was peculiarly his own. He had long worked for it. Even while the war of 1866 was still being waged, he had foreseen that a day would come when Germany and Austria, now that they were separated, might become, as they never had been when joined by an unnatural union, honest allies. It was probably to a great extent brought about by the strong regard and confidence which the Austrian Emperor reposed in the German Chancellor. The beginnings of approximation were laid by the dismissal of Beust, who himself now was to become a personal friend of the statesman against whom he had for so long, and with such ingenuity, waged an unequal conflict. The union was sealed when, in December 1872, the Tsar of Russia and Francis Joseph came to Berlin as guests of the emperor. There was no signed contract, no written alliance, but the old union of the Eastern monarchies under which a generation before Europe had groaned was now restored, and on the continent there was no place to which France could look for help or sympathy. The years that followed were those in which foreign affairs gave Bismarck least anxiety or occupation. He even began to complain that he was dull. After all these years of conflict and intrigue, he found the security which he now enjoyed uninteresting. Now and again, the shadow of war passed over Europe, but it was soon dispelled. The most serious was in 1875. It appears that the French reforms of the army and some movements of French troops had caused alarm at Berlin. I say alarm, though it is difficult to believe that any serious concern could have been felt. There was, however, a party who believed that war must come sooner or later, and it was better, they said, not to wait till France was again powerful and had won allies. Surely the wisest thing was, while she was still weak and friendless, to take some excuse, and how easy would it be to find the excuse, fall upon her and crush and destroy, so that she could never again raise her head, treat her as she had in old days treated Germany. How far this plan was deliberately adopted we do not know, but in the spring of this year the signs became so alarming that both the Russian and the English governments were seriously disturbed and interfered. So sober a statesman as Lord Derby believed that the danger was real. The Tsar, who visited Berlin at the beginning of April, dealt with the matter personally. The Queen of England wrote a letter to the German Emperor in which she said that the information she had could leave no doubt that an aggressive war on France was meditated, and used her personal influence with the sovereign to prevent it. The emperor himself had not sympathized with the idea of war, and it is said, did not even know of the approaching danger. It did not require the intervention of other sovereigns to induce him to refuse his assent to a wanton war, but this advice from foreign powers, of course, caused great indignation in Bismarck. It was just the kind of thing which always angered him beyond everything. He maintained that he had had no warlike intentions, that the reports were untrue. The whole story had its origin, he said, in the intrigues of the Ultramontanes and the vanity of Gorchakov. The object was to make it appear that France owed her security and preservation to the friendly interference of Russia, and thereby prepare the way for an alliance between the two powers. It is almost impossible to believe that Bismarck had seriously intended to bring about a war. He must have known that the other powers of Europe would not allow a second and unprovoked attack on France. He would not be likely to risk all he had achieved and bring about a European coalition against him. On the other hand, his explanation is probably not the whole truth. Even German writers confessed that the plan of attacking France was meditated, and it was a plan of a nature to recommend itself to the military party in Prussia. Yet this may have been the beginning of a divergence with Russia. The union had depended more on the personal feelings of the Tsar than on the wishes of the people or their real interests. The rising pan-Slavonic party was anti-German. Their leader was General Ignatieff, but Gorchakov, partly perhaps from personal hostility to Bismarck, partly from a just consideration of Russian interest, sympathized with their anti-Teutonic policy. The outbreak of disturbance in the East roused that national feeling which had slept for 20 years. In truth, the strong patriotism of modern Germany naturally created a similar feeling in the neighboring countries, just as the Germans were proud to free themselves from the dominant culture of France, so the Russians began to look with jealousy on the Teutonic influence, which, since the days of Peter the Great, had been so powerful among them. In internal matters, the situation was very different. Here, Bismarck could not rule in the same undisputed manner. He had rivals, critics, and colleagues. The power of the Prussian parliament and the Reichstag was indeed limited, but without their assent, no new law could be passed. Each year, their assent must be obtained to the budget. Though they had waived all claims to control the foreign policy, the parties still criticized and often rejected the laws proposed by the government. Then, in Prussian affairs, he could not act without the goodwill of his colleagues. In finance, in legal reform, the management of church and schools, the initiative belonged to the ministers responsible for each department. Some of the difficulties of government would have been met had Bismarck identified himself with a single party, formed a party ministry, and carried out their program. This he always refused to do. He did not wish in his old age to become a parliamentary minister, for had he depended for his support on a party, then if he lost their confidence or they lost the confidence of the country, he would have had to retire from office. The whole work of his earlier years would have been undone. What he wished to secure was a government party, a Bismarck party, sans phrase, who would always support all his measures in internal as well as external policy. In this, however, he did not succeed. He was therefore reduced to another course. In order to get the measures of the government passed, he executed a series of alliances, now with one, now with another party. In these, however, he had to give as well as to receive. And it is curious to see how easily his pride was offended and his anger roused by any attempt of the party with which at the time he was allied to control and influence his policy. No one of the alliances lasted long, and he seems to have taken peculiar pleasure in breaking away from each of them in turn when the time came. The alliance with the conservatives, which he had inherited from the older days, had begun to break directly after 1866. Many of them had been disappointed by his policy in that year. The grant of universal suffrage had alarmed them. They had wished that he would use his power to check and punish the parliament for its opposition. Instead of that, he asked for an indemnity. They felt that they had borne with him the struggle for the integrity of the Prussian monarchy. No sooner was the victory won than he held out his hand to the liberals, and it was to them that the prize went. They were hurt and disappointed, and this personal feeling was increased by Bismarck's want of consideration, his brusqueness of manner, his refusal to consider complaints and remonstrances. Even the success of 1870 had not altogether reconciled them. These Prussian nobles, the men to whom in earlier days he himself had belonged, saw with regret the name of King of Prussia hidden behind the newer glory of the German Emperor. It is curious to read how Ibn Horn speaks with something of contempt and disgust of this new title. I hope, he writes, Bismarck will be in a better temper now that the Kaiser egg had been safely hatched. It was, however, the struggle with the Catholic Church which achieved the separation. The complete subjection of the Church to the state, the new laws for school inspection, the introduction of compulsory civil marriage were all opposed to the strongest and the healthiest feelings of the Prussian conservatives. These did not seem to be matters in which the safety of the empire was concerned. Bismarck had simply gone over to and adopted the program of the liberals. He was supporting that all-pervading power of the Prussian bureaucracy which he in his earlier days had so bitterly attacked. Then came a proposal for change in the local government which would diminish the influence of the landed proprietors. The conservatives refused to support these measures. The conservative majority in the House of Lords threw them out. Bismarck's own brother, all his old friends and comrades were now ranged against him. He accepted opposition from them as little as from anyone else. The consent of the king was obtained to the creation of new peers, and by these means the obnoxious measures were forced through the unwilling House. Bismarck, by his speeches, intensified the bitterness. He came down himself to make an attack on the conservatives. The government is disappointed, he said. We had looked for confidence from the Conservative Party. Confidence is a delicate plant. If it is once destroyed, it does not grow again. We shall have to look elsewhere for support. A crisis in his relations to the party came at the end of 1872. Up this time, Hone had still remained in the government. Now, in consequence of the manner in which the creation of peers had been decided upon, he requested permission to resign. The king, who could not bear to part with him, and who really, in many matters of internal policy, had more sympathy with him than with Bismarck, refused to accept the resignation. The crisis which arose had an unexpected ending. Bismarck himself resigned the office of Minister-President of Prussia, which was transferred to Hone, keeping only that of Foreign Minister and Chancellor of the Empire. A letter to Hone shows the deep depression under which he labored at this time, chiefly the result of ill health. It was, he said, an unheard of anomaly that the foreign minister of a great empire should be responsible also for internal affairs, and yet he himself had arranged that it should be so. The desertion of the Conservative Party had, he said, deprived him of his footing. He was dispirited by the loss of his old friends and the illness of his wife. He spoke of his advancing years and his conviction that he had not much longer to live. The king scarcely knows how he is riding a good horse to death. He would continue to do what he could in foreign affairs, but he would no longer be responsible for colleagues over whom he had no influence except by requests and for the wishes of the emperor which he could not share. The arrangement lasted for a year, and then Hone had again to request, and this time received permission to retire into private life. His health would no longer allow him to endure the constant anxiety of office. His retirement occasioned genuine grief to the king, and of all the severances which he had to undergo, this was probably that which affected Bismarck most. For none of his colleagues could he ever have the same affection he had had for Hone. He it was who had brought him into the ministry, and had gone through with him all the days of storm and trouble. It will be lonely for me, he writes, in my work, even more so, the old friends become enemies, and one makes no new ones, as God will. In 1873, he again assumed the presidency. The resignation of Hone was followed by a complete breach with the party of the Kreuzzeitung. The more moderate of the conservatives split off from it and continued to support the government. The remainder entered the campaign of factious opposition. End of section 25. Section 26 of Bismarck and the Foundation of the German Empire by James Headlam. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by S.S. Kim, Seoul, South Korea. Chapter 15, The New Empire, 1871 to 1878. Part 2. The quarrel was inevitable, for quite apart from the question of religion, it would indeed have been impossible to govern Germany according to their principles. We may, however, regret that the quarrel was not conducted with more amenity. These Prussian nobles were of the same race as Bismarck himself. They resembled him in character, if not in ability. They believed that they had been betrayed, and they did not easily forgive. They were not scrupulous in the weapons they adopted. The press was used for anonymous attacks on his person and his character. They accused him of using his public position for making money by speculation and of sacrificing to that the alliance with Russia. More than once he had recourse to the law of libel to defend himself against these unworthy insults. When he publicly, in the Reichstag, protested against the language of the Kreuzzeitung, the dishonorable attacks and the scandalous lies it spread abroad, a large number of the leading men among the Prussian nobility signed the declaration, formally defending the management of the paper as true adherents of the monarchical and conservative banner. These declaranten, as they were called, were henceforward enemies whom he could never forgive. At the bottom of the list, we read, not without emotion, the words, signed with deep regret, A. von Taden. So far apart were now the two knights-errants of the Christian monarchy. It was in reality the end of the old conservative party. It had done its work. Bismarck was now thrown on the support of the national liberals. Since 1866, they had grown in numbers and in weight. They represented at this time the general sense of the German people. It was with their help that during the years down to 1878, the new institutions for the empire were built up. In the elections of 1871, they numbered 120. In 1874, their numbers rose to 152. They had not an absolute majority, but in all questions regarding the defense of the empire, foreign policy, and the army, they were supported by the moderate conservatives. In the conflict with the Catholics and internal matters, they could generally depend on the support of the progressives, so that as long as they maintained their authority, they gave the government the required majority in both the Prussian and the German parliament. There were differences in the party which afterwards were to lead to a secession, but during this time, which they looked upon as the golden era of the empire, they succeeded in maintaining their unity. They numbered many of the ablest leaders, the lawyers and men of learning who had opposed Bismarck at the time of the conflict. Their leader was Bennigsen, himself a Hanoverian. He had brought no feelings of hostility from the older days of conflict. Moderate, tactful, restrained, patriotic, he was the only man who, when difficulties arose, was always able to approach the Chancellor, sure of finding some tenable compromise. Different was it with Lasker, the ablest of parliamentary orators, whose subordination to the decisions of the party was often doubtful, and whose criticism, friendly as it often was, always aroused Bismarck's anger. As a matter of fact, the alliance was, however, never complete. It was always felt that at any moment some question might arise on which it would be wrecked. This was shown by Bismarck's language as early as 1871. In a debate on the army, he explained that what he demanded was full support. Members, he said, were expressly elected to support him. They had no right to make conditions or withdraw their support. If they did so, he would resign. The party, which was very loyal to him, constantly gave up its own views when he made it a question of confidence, but the strain was there and was always felt. The great question now, as before, was that of the organization of the army. It will be remembered that under the North German Confederation, a provisional arrangement was made by which the numbers of the army in peace were to be fixed at 1% of the population. This terminated at the end of 1871. The government, however, did not then consider it safe to alter the arrangement, and with some misgiving, the Reichstag accepted the proposal that this system should be applied to the whole empire for 3 years. If, however, the numbers of the army were absolutely fixed in this way, the Reichstag would cease to have any control over the expenses. All other important taxes and expenses came before the individual states. In 1874, the government had to make their proposal for the future. This was that the system which had hitherto been provisionally accepted should become permanent, and that the army should henceforward, in time of peace, always consist of the same number of men. To agree to this would be permanently to give up all possibility of exercising any control over the finance. It was impossible for the National Liberal Party to accept the proposal without giving up at the same time all hope of constitutional development. Bismarck was ill and could take no part in defending the law. They voted against it. It was thrown out, and it seemed as though a new conflict was going to arise. When the Reichstag adjourned in April for the Easter holidays, the agitation spread over the country, but the country was determined not again to have a conflict on the budget. There was a regular fanaticism for unconditional acceptance of the law. Those even on the left refused to hear anything of constitutional considerations, writes one member of the National Liberal Party after meeting his constituents. If the Reichstag persisted in their refusal and a dissolution took place, there was no doubt that there would be a great majority for the government. It was the first time since 1870 that the question of constitutional privileges were raised, and now it was found, as ever afterwards was the case, that for the German people, whatever might be the opinion of their elected representatives, the name of Bismarck alone outweighed all else. Bennigsen arranged a compromise, and the required number of men was agreed to, not indeed permanently, but for 7 years. For 4 years more, the alliance was continued. At this time, all other questions were thrown into the shade by the great conflict with the Roman Catholic Church on which the government had embarked. Looking back now, it is still difficult to judge or even to understand the causes which brought it about. Both sides claimed that they were acting in self-defense. Bismarck has often explained his motives, but we cannot be sure that those he puts forward were the only considerations by which he was moved. He, however, insisted that the struggle was not religious but political. He was not moved by Protestant animosity to the Catholic Church, but by his alarm lest in the organization of the Roman hierarchy a power might arise within the empire which would be hostile to the state. But even if the Chancellor himself was at first free from Protestant hatred to Catholicism, and this is not quite clear, he was forced into alliance with a large party who appealed at once to the memories of the Reformation, who stirred up all that latent hatred of Rome which is as strong a force in North Germany as in England, and with others who saw in this an opportunity for more completely subduing all, Protestant and Catholic alike, to the triumphant power of the state, and making one more step towards the dissociation of the state from any religious body. The immediate cause of the struggle was the proclamation of the infallibility of the Pope. It might be thought that this change or development in the constitutions of the Roman Church was one which concerned chiefly Roman Catholics. This is the view which Bismarck seems to have taken during the meetings of the Vatican Council. The opposition to the decrees was strongest among the German bishops, and Prince Hohenlohe, the Prime Minister of Bavaria, supported by his brother, the Cardinal, was anxious to persuade the governments of Europe to interfere, and, as they could have done, to prevent the Council from coming to any conclusion. Bismarck refused on behalf of the Prussian government to take any steps in this direction. The conclusion of the Council and the proclamation of the decrees took place just at the time of the outbreak of war with France. For some months, Bismarck, occupied as he was with other matters, was unable to consider the changes which might be caused. It was, moreover, very important for him during the negotiations with Bavaria, which lasted all through the autumn, not to do anything which would arouse the fears of the ultramontanes or intensify their reluctance to enter the empire. In the winter of 1870, the first sign of the dangers ahead was to be seen. They arose from the occupation of Rome by the Italians. The inevitable result of this was that the Roman Catholics of all countries in Europe were at once given a common cause of political endeavor. They were bound, each of them, in his own state, to use his full influence to procure interference either by diplomacy or by arms, and to work for the rescue of the prisoner of the Vatican. The German Catholics felt this as strongly as their co-religionists, and while he was still at Versailles, a cardinal and bishop of the church addressed a memorial to the King of Prussia on this matter. This attempt to influence the foreign policy of the new empire and to use it for a purpose alien to the direct interest of Germany was very repugnant to Bismarck and was quite sufficient to arouse feelings of hostility towards the Roman Catholics. These were increased when he heard that the Roman Catholic leaders were combining to form a new political party. In the elections for the first Reichstag, this movement was very successful, and 50 members were returned whose sole bond of union was religion. This he looked upon as a mobilization of the church against the state. The formation of a political party founded simply on unity of confession was, he said, an unheard of innovation in political life. His distrust increased when he found that their leader was Windthorst, a former minister of the King of Hanover, and as a patriotic Hanoverian, one of the chief opponents of a powerful and centralized government. The influence the church had in the Polish provinces was a further cause of hostility and seemed to justify him in condemning them as anti-German. During the first session, the new party prominently appeared on 2 occasions. In the debate on the address to the Crown, they asked for the interference of Germany on behalf of the Pope. In this, they stood alone, and the division found no supporters. Then they demanded that in the constitution of the empire, certain clauses from the Prussian constitution should be introduced, which would ensure freedom to all religious denominations. Here, they gained considerable support from some other parties. An impartial observer will find it difficult to justify from these acts the charge of disloyalty to the empire. But a storm of indignation arose in the press, especially in the organs of the National Liberal Party, and it was supported by those of the government. The desire for conflict was awakened. Meetings were held in the autumn of 1871 to defend the Protestant faith, which hardly seemed to have been attacked, and the clearer cause for dispute soon occurred. It was required by the authorities of the Church that all bishops and priests should declare their assent to the new Vatican decrees. The majority did so, but a certain number refused. They were, of course, excommunicated. A secession from the Roman Catholic Church took place, and the new communion formed, to which the name of Old Catholics was given. The bishops required that all the priests and religious teachers at the universities and schools who had refused to obey the orders of the Pope should be dismissed from their office. The Prussian government refused their assent. The legal question involved was a difficult one. The government held that as the Roman Catholic Church had changed its teachings, those who maintained the old doctrine must be supported in the offices conferred on them. The church authorities denied there had been any essential change. On the whole, we may say that they were right. A priest of the Catholic Church held his position not only in virtue of his assent to the actual doctrines taught, but was also bound by his vow of obedience to accept any fresh teaching which, in accordance with the constitution of the Church and by the recognized organ of government, should in the future also be declared to be of faith. The duty of every man to obey the laws applies not only to the laws existing at any moment, but to any future laws which may be passed by the proper agent of legislation. Even though the doctrine of infallibility were a new doctrine which is very doubtful, it had been passed at the council, and the proceedings of the council, even if in some details they were irregular, were not more so than those of any other council in the past. The action of the government in supporting the Old Catholics may, however, be attributed to another motive. The Catholics maintained that Bismarck desired to take this opportunity of creating a national German church and reunite Protestants and Catholics. To have done so, had it been possible, would have been indeed to confer on the country the greatest of all blessings. We cannot doubt that the thought had often come into Bismarck's mind. It would be the proper and fitting conclusion to the work of creating a nation. It was, however, impossible. Under no circumstances could it have been done by a Protestant statesman. The impulse must have come from Bavaria, and the opposition of the Bavarian bishops to the Vatican decrees had been easily overcome. Twice an opportunity had presented itself of making a national German church, once at the Reformation, once after the Revolution. On both occasions it was lost, and it will never recur. The result, however, was that a bitter feeling of opposition was created between church and state. The secessionist priests were maintained in their positions by the government. They were excommunicated by the bishops. Students were forbidden to attend their lectures and the people to worship in the churches where they ministered. It spread even to the army, when the Minister of War required the army chaplain at Cologne to celebrate Mass in a church which was used also by the Old Catholics. He was forbidden to do so by his bishop, and the bishop was in consequence deprived of his salary and threatened with arrest. The conflict having once begun soon spread. A new minister of culture was appointed. In the Reichstag, a law was proposed expelling the Jesuits from Germany, and a number of important laws, the so-called May laws, were introduced into the Prussian parliament, giving to the state great powers with regard to the education and appointment of priests. It was, for instance, ordered that no one should be appointed to a cure of souls who was not a German and had not been brought up and educated in the state schools and universities of Prussia. Then other laws were introduced, to which we have already referred, making civil marriage compulsory so as to cripple the very strong power which the Roman Catholic priests could exercise not only by refusing their consent to mixed marriages, but also by refusing to marry old Catholics. A law was introduced taking the inspection of elementary schools out of the hands of the clergy, and finally a change was made in those articles of the Prussian constitution which ensured to each denomination the management of its own affairs. Bismarck was probably not responsible for the drafting of all these laws. He only occasionally took part in the discussion and was often away from Berlin. The contrast between these proposals and the principles he had maintained in his earlier years was very marked. His old friend Kleist recalled the eloquent speech which in former years he had made against civil marriage. Bismarck did not attempt to defend himself against the charge of inconsistency. He did not even avow that he had changed his personal opinions. He had, however, he said, learned to submit his personal convictions to the requirements of the state. He had only done so unwillingly and by a great struggle. This was to be the end of the doctrine of the Christian state. With Gneist, Lasker, Virchow, he was subduing the church to this new idol of the state. He was doing that against which, in the old days, he had struggled with the greatest resolution and spoken with the greatest eloquence. Not many years were to go by before he began to repent of what he had done, for as he saw the new danger from social democracy, he, like many other Germans, believed that the true means of defeating it was to be found in increased intensity of religious conviction. It was, however, then too late. He, however, especially in the Prussian upper house, threw all the weight of his authority into the conflict. It was, he said, not a religious conflict, but a political one. They were not actuated by hatred of Catholicism, but they were protecting the rights of the state. The question at issue, he said, is not a struggle of an evangelical dynasty against the Catholic Church. It was the old struggle, a struggle for power as old as the human race, between king and priest, a struggle which is much older than the appearance of our Redeemer in this world, a struggle which has filled German history of the Middle Ages till the destruction of the German Empire, and which found its conclusion when the last representative of the glorious Swabian dynasty died on the scaffold under the axe of a French conqueror who stood in alliance with the Pope. We are not far from an analogous solution of the situation, always translated into the customs of our time. He assured the House that now, as always, he would defend the empire against internal and external enemies. Rest assured, we will not go to Canossa, he said. In undertaking this struggle with the Church, he had two enemies to contend with, the Pope and the government of the Church on the one side, on the other, the Catholic population of Germany. He tried to come to some agreement with the Pope and to separate the two. It seemed, in fact, as if the real enemy to be contended against was not the foreign priesthood, but the Catholic democracy in Germany. All Bismarck's efforts to separate the two and to procure the assistance of the Pope against the party of the center were to be unavailing. For some years, all official communication between the German government and the Papal See was broken off. It was not till the death of Pius IX and the accession of more liberal-minded Pope that communication was restored. Then we are surprised to find Bismarck appealing to the Pope to use his influence on the center in order to persuade them to vote for a proposed increase in the German army. This is a curious comment on the boast. Will not go to Canossa. The truth is that in undertaking the conflict and associating himself with the anti-clerical party, Bismarck had stirred up an enemy whom he was not able to overcome. He soon found that the priests and the Catholics were men of a different caliber to the liberals. They dared to do what none of the progressives had ventured on. They disobeyed the law. With them, it was not likely that the conflict would be confined to parliamentary debates. The government attempted to meet this resistance, but in vain. The priests were deprived of their cures. Bishops were thrown into prison. Nearly half the Catholic parishes in Prussia were deprived of their spiritual shepherds. The churches were closed. There was no one to celebrate baptisms or weddings. Against this resistance, what could the government do? The people supported the leaders of the party, and the united body of 100 members under Windthorst, ablest of parliamentary leaders, was committed to absolute opposition to every government measure so long as the conflict continued. Can you be surprised that as the years went on, Bismarck looked with some concern on the result of the struggle he had brought about? He attempted to conceal the failure. The result will be, he said, that we shall have two great parties, one which supports and maintains the state, and another which attacks it. The former will be the great majority, and it will be formed in the school of conflict. These words are the strongest condemnation of his policy. It could not be wise for any statesman to arrange that party conflict should take the form of loyalty and disloyalty to the empire. There can be little doubt that his sense of failure helped to bring about a feeling of enmity towards the national liberals. Certainly in the spring of 1877, he sent in his resignation. There were, however, other reasons for doing this. He had become aware that the financial policy of the empire had not been successful. On every side, it seemed that the new blood and new methods were required. In financial matters, he had little experience or authority. He had to depend on his colleagues, and he complained of their unfruitfulness. Influenced perhaps by his perception of this, on the pretext, a genuine pretext of ill health, he asked the emperor to relieve him of his offices. The emperor refused. Never, he wrote on the side of the minute. Instead, he granted to Bismarck unlimited leave of absence. In the month of April, the chancellor retired to Varzin. For 10 months he was absent from Berlin, and when he returned, recruited in health, in February 1878, it was soon apparent that a new period in his career and in the history of the empire was to begin. End of section 26. Section 27 of Bismarck and the Foundation of the German Empire by James Headlam. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by S.S. Kim, Seoul, South Korea. Chapter 16. The Triple Alliance and Economic Reform, 1878 to 1887. Part 1. The year 1878 forms a turning point both in internal and in external politics. Up to this year, Prussia has been allied with the two Eastern monarchies. The empire has been governed by the help of the National Liberal Party. The chief enemy has been the clericals. The traditions of the time before the war are still maintained. After this year, the understanding with Russia breaks down. Instead of it, the peace of Europe is preserved by the Triple Alliance with Austria and Italy. In internal affairs, the change is even more marked. The rising power of the socialists is the enemy to be fought against. For this conflict, peace has to be made with the Catholics. The May laws are modified or repealed. The alliance with liberalism breaks down, and the efforts of the government are devoted to a far-reaching scheme of financial reform and social legislation. When in April 1877, the emperor refused to accept Bismarck's resignation, the whole country applauded the decision. In the Reichstag, a great demonstration was made of confidence in the chancellor. Everyone felt that he could not be spared at a time when the complications in the East were bringing new dangers upon Europe, and in the seclusion of Varzin, he did not cease during the next months to direct the foreign policy of the empire. He was able, with the other governments of Europe, to prevent the spread of hostilities from Turkey to the rest of Europe, and when, the next year, the English government refused its assent to the provisional peace of San Stefano, it was the unanimous desire of all the other states that the settlement of Turkey should be submitted to a congress at Berlin, over which he should preside. It was the culmination of his public career. It was the recognition by Europe in the most impressive way of his primacy among living statesmen. In his management of the Congress, he answered to the expectations formed of him. We do not wish to go, he had said, the way of Napoleon. We do not desire to be the arbitrators or schoolmasters of Europe. We do not wish to force our policy on other states by appealing to the strength of our army. I look on our task as a more useful, though a humbler one. It is enough if we can be an honest broker. He succeeded in the task he had set before himself, and in reconciling the apparently incompatible desires of England and Russia. Again and again, when the Congress seemed about to break up without result, he made himself the spokesman of Russian wishes and conveyed them to Lord Beaconsfield, the English plenipotentiary. Nonetheless, the friendship of Russia, which had before wavered, now broke down. A bitter attack on Germany and Bismarck was begun in the Russian press. The new German fiscal policy led to misunderstandings. The Tsar, in private letters to the Emperor, demanded, in the negotiations that were still going on, the absolute and unconditional support of Germany to all Russian demands as the condition of Russian friendship. In the autumn of the next year, matters came near to war. It was in these circumstances that Bismarck brought about that alliance which ever since then has governed European politics. He hastily arranged a meeting with Count Andrassy, the Austrian minister, and in a few days the two statesmen agreed on a defensive alliance between the two empires. Many years later, in 1886, the instrument of alliance was published. It was agreed that if either of the German states was attacked by Russia, the other would join to defend it. If either was attacked by France, the other would observe neutrality. But if the French were supported by Russia, then the first clause would come into force. The Emperor of Austria willingly gave his assent. It was only after a prolonged struggle that Bismarck was able to gain the assent of his own sovereign. This alliance, which in the next year was joined by Italy, again gave Germany the ruling position in Europe. During this crisis in foreign affairs, Bismarck was occupied by another, which threatened to be equally serious, in home politics. In the spring of 1878, an attempt was made on the life of the emperor. A young man named Hobel, a shoemaker's apprentice, shot at him in the streets of Berlin, fortunately without result. The attempt naturally created intense indignation throughout the country. This was increased when it became known that he had been to some extent connected with the Socialist Party, and it seemed as though the motives of the crime were supplied by the violent speeches made at socialist gatherings. Bismarck had long regarded the growth of socialism with concern. He determined to use this opportunity to crush it. He at once brought into the Bundesrat a very severe law forbidding all socialist agitation and propaganda. He succeeded in passing it through the council, but it was thrown out in the Reichstag by a very large majority. No one voted for it except the conservatives. The law indeed was so drawn up that one does not see how anyone could have voted for it. The first clause began, "Printed writings and unions which follow the aims of social democracy may be forbidden by the Federal Council." But as was pointed out, among the aims of the social democracy were many which were good in themselves, and many others which, though they may be considered harmful by other parties, were at least legitimate. Directly afterwards, the Reichstag was prorogued. 10 days later, another attempt was made on the emperor's life. This time, a man of the name of Nobelin, an educated man who had studied at the university, shot at him while driving in the Unteren Linden, and wounded him severely in the head and arms with large shot. The emperor was driven home to his palace almost unconscious, and for some time his life was in danger. This second attempt in so short a time on the life of man almost 80 years of age, so universally loved and respected, who had conferred such benefits on his country, naturally aroused a storm of indignation. When Bismarck received the news, his first words were, "Now the Reichstag must be dissolved." This was done. The general elections took place while the excitement was still hot, and of course resulted in a great loss to those parties, especially the National Liberals, who had voted against the socialist law. The Centre alone retained its numbers. Before this new parliament, a fresh law was laid, drafted with much more skill. It absolutely forbade all speeches or writings in favor of plans for overthrowing the order of society or directed against marriage and property. It enabled the government to proclaim in all large towns a state of siege, and to expel from them, by the mere decree of the police, anyone suspected of socialist agitation. The law, which was easily carried, was enforced with great severity. A state of siege was proclaimed in Berlin and many other places. Socialist papers, and even books, for instance the writing of Lassalle, was forbidden. They might not even be read in public libraries. And for the next 12 years, the Socialist Party had to carry on their propaganda by secret means. This socialist law is very disappointing. We find the government again having recourse to the same means for checking and guiding opinion which Metternich had used 50 years before. Not indeed that the socialists themselves had any ground for complaint. Their avowed end was the overthrow of government and society. They professed to be at war with all established institutions. If they confined their efforts to legal measures and did not use violence, it was only because the time had not yet come. The men who avowed admiration for the Paris Commune, who were openly preparing for a revolution more complete than any which Europe had hitherto seen, could not complain if the government, while there was yet time, used every means for crushing them. The mistake was in supposing that this measure would be successful. Bismarck would indeed, had he been able, have made it far more severe. His own idea was that anyone who had been legally convicted of holding socialist opinions should be deprived of the franchise and excluded from the parliament. What a misunderstanding does this show of the whole object and nature of representative institutions. It had been decided that in Germany, parliament was not to govern. What was then its function except to display the opinions of the people? If, as was the case, so large a proportion of the German nation belonged to a party of discontent, then it was above all desirable that their wishes and desires should have open expression and be discussed where they could be overthrown. The government had enormous means of influencing opinion. In the old days, the men of letters had been unprincipled in opposition. Now Germany was flooded by papers, books, and pamphlets, all devoted to the most extravagant praise of the new institutions. The excuse which was made for these laws was not a sufficient one. It is seldom necessary to meet political assassination by repressive measures, for they must always create a danger which they intend to avert. There was not the slightest ground for supposing that either Hobel or Nobelling had any confederates. There was no plot. It was but the wild and wicked action of an individual. It was as absurd to put a large party under police control for this reason as it was to punish liberals for the action of sand. And it was ineffective, as the events of the next years showed, for the socialist law did not spare Germany from the infection of outrage which in these years overran Europe. The socialist laws was soon followed by other proposals of a more useful kind, and now we had come to one of the most remarkable episodes in Bismarck's career. He was over 60 years of age. His health was uncertain. He had long complained of the extreme toil and the constant annoyance which his public duties brought upon him. It might appear that he had finished his work, and if he could not retire altogether, would give over the management of all internal affairs to others. That he would now take upon himself a whole new department of public duties, that he would, after his prolonged absence, appear again as leader and innovator in parliamentary strife. This no one anticipated. Up to the year 1876, he had taken little active part in finance. His energies had been entirely absorbed by foreign affairs, and he had been content to adopt and support the measures recommended by his technical advisers. When he had interfered at all, it had only been on those occasions when, as with regard to commercial treaties, the policies of his colleagues had impeded his own political objects. In 1864, he had been much annoyed because difference on commercial matters had interfered with the good understanding with Austria, which at that time he was trying to maintain. Since the foundation of the empire, almost the complete control over the commercial policy of the empire had been entrusted to Delbrück, who held the very important post of President of the Imperial Chancery, and was treated by Bismarck with the deference and consideration which no other of his fellow workers received except Moltke and Horn. Delbrück was a confirmed free trader, and the result was that, partly by commercial treaties and partly by the abolition of customs duties, the tariff had been reduced and simplified. The years following the war had, however, not been altogether prosperous. A great outbreak of speculation was followed in 1873 by a serious commercial crisis, and since that year there had been a permanent decrease in the imperial receipts. This was, for political reasons, a serious inconvenience. By the arrangement made in 1866, the proceeds of the customs and of the indirect taxation, with some exceptions, were paid into the exchequer of the Federation and afterwards of the Empire. If the receipts from these sources were not sufficient to meet the imperial requirements, the deficit had to be made up by contributions paid in proportion to their population by the separate states. During later years, these contributions had annually increased, and it is needless to point out that this was sufficient to make the relations of the state government to the central authorities disagreeable, and to cause some discontent with the new constitution. This meant also an increase of the amount which had to be raised by direct taxation. Now, Bismarck had always much disliked direct taxes. He had again and again pointed out that they were paid with great reluctance and often fell with peculiar hardship on that very large class which could only just by constant and assiduous labor make an income sufficient for their needs. Worst of all was it when they were unable to pay even the few shillings required. They then had to undergo the hardship and disgrace of distraint and see their furniture seized and sold by the tax collectors. He had therefore always wished that the income derived from customs and indirect taxation should be increased so as by degrees to do away with the necessity for direct taxation, and if this could be done, then instead of the states paying an annual contribution to the empire, they would receive from the central government pecuniary assistance. The dislike of direct taxation is an essential part of Bismarck's reform. He especially disapproved of the Prussian system, the barbarous system, as he called it, according to which every man had to pay a small portion, it might be even a few groschen, in direct taxes. I ascribe, he said, the large part of our emigration to the fact that the emigrant wishes to escape the direct pressure of the taxes and execution, and to go to a land where the Klassensteuer does not exist, and where he will also have the pleasure of knowing that the produce of his labors will be protected against foreign interference. His opinion cannot be called exaggerated if it is true that, as he stated, there were every year over 1 million executions involving the seizure and sale of household goods on account of arrears of taxation. It was not only the state taxes to which he objected. The local rates for municipal expenses and especially for education fell very heavily on the inhabitants of large cities such as Berlin. He intended to devote part of the money which was raised by indirect taxation to relieving the rates. His first proposals for raising the money were of a very sweeping nature. He wished to introduce a state monopoly for the sale of tobacco, brandy, and beer. He entered into calculations by which he proved that, were his policy adopted, all direct taxation might be repealed, and he would have a large surplus for an object which he had very much at heart, the provision of old age pensions. It was a method of legislation copied from that which prevails in France and Italy. He pointed out with perfect justice that the revenue raised in Germany from the consumption of tobacco was much smaller than it ought to be. The total sum gained by the state was not a tenth of that which was produced in England by taxing the tobacco, but no one could maintain that smoking was more common in England than in Germany. In fact, tobacco was less heavily taxed in Germany than in any other country in Europe. In introducing a monopoly, Bismarck intended and hoped not only to relieve the pressure of direct taxation, though this would have been a change sufficient in its magnitude and importance for most men, but proposed to use the very large sum which the government would have at its disposal for the direct relief of the working classes. The socialist law was not to go alone. He intended absolutely to stamp out this obnoxious agitation, but it was not from any indifference as to the condition of the working classes. From his earliest days, he had been opposed to the liberal doctrine of laissez-faire. It will be remembered how much he had disliked the bourgeois domination of the July monarchy. As a young man, he had tried to prevent the abolition of guilds. He considered that much of the distress and discontent arose from the unrestricted influence of capital. He was only acting in accordance with the oldest and best traditions of the Prussian monarchy when he called in the power of the state to protect the poor. His plan was a very bold one. He wished to institute a fund from which there should be paid to every working man who was incapacitated by sickness, accident, or old age, a pension from the state. In his original plan, he intended the working men should not be required to make any contribution themselves towards this fund. It was not to be made to appeal to them as a new burden imposed on them by the state. The tobacco monopoly, he said, he looked on as the patrimony of the disinherited. He did not fear the charge of socialism which might be brought against him. He defended himself by the provisions of the Prussian law. The Code of Frederick the Great contained the words, "It is the duty of the state to provide for the sustenance and support of those of its citizens who cannot procure sustenance themselves, and again, work adapted to their strength and capacity shall be supplied to those who lack means and opportunity of earning a livelihood for themselves and those dependent on them." In the most public way, the new policy was introduced by an imperial message on November 17, 1881, in which the emperor expressed his conviction that the social difficulties could not be healed simply by the repression or exaggeration of the social democracy, but at the same time, the welfare of the workmen must be advanced. This new policy had the warm approval of both the emperor and the crown prince. No one greeted more heartily the change than Windthorst. "Allow me," he once said to Bismarck, "to speak openly. You have done me much evil in my life, but as a German patriot, I must confess to you my gratitude that after all his political deeds, you have persuaded our imperial master to turn to this path of social reform." There were, he said, difficulties to be met. He approved of the end, but not of all the details. And he continued, "Something of the difficulty, if I may say so, you cause yourself. You're often too stormy for us. You're always coming with something new, and we cannot always follow you in it. But you must not take that amiss. We are both old men, and the emperor is much older than we are. But we should like ourselves in our lifetime to see some of these reforms established, that I wish for all of us and for all our German country, and we will do our best to help in it. Opinions may differ as to the wisdom of Bismarck's social and financial policy. No one can deny their admiration for the energy and patriotism which he displayed. It was no small thing for him, at his age, to come out of his comparative retirement to bring forward proposals which would be sure to excite the bitterest opposition of the men with whom he had been working, to embark again on a parliamentary conflict as keen as any of those which had so taxed his energies in his younger years. Not content with inaugurating and suggesting these plans, he himself undertook the immediate execution of them. In addition to his other offices, in 1880 he undertook that of Minister of Trade in Prussia, for he found no one whom he could entirely trust to carry out his proposals. During the next years, he again took a prominent part in the parliamentary debates. Day after day, he attended to answer objections and to defend his measures in some of his ablest and longest speeches. By his proposals for a duty on corn, he regained the support of the most of the conservatives, but in the Reichstag, which was elected in 1884, he found himself opposed by a majority consisting of the center, socialists, and progressives. Many of the laws were rejected or amended, and it was not until 1890 that, in a modified form, the whole of the social legislation had been carried through. For the monopoly, he gained no support. Scarcely a voice was raised in its favor, nor can you be surprised at this. It was a proposal very characteristic of his internal policy. He had a definite aim in view, and at once took the shortest, boldest, and most direct road towards it, putting aside the thought of all further consequences. In this, others could not follow him. Quite apart from the difficulties of organization and the unknown effects of the law on all those who gained their livelihood by the growth, preparation, and sale of tobacco, there was a deep feeling that it was not safe to entrust the government with so enormous a power. Men did not wish to see so many thousands enrolled in the army of officials, already too great. They did not desire a new check on the freedom of life and occupation, nor that the government should have the uncontrolled use of so great a sum of money, and then the use he proposed to make of the proceeds. If the calculation were correct, if the results were what he foretold, if from this monopoly they would be able to pay not only the chief expenses of the government, but also assign an old age pension to every German workman who reached the age of 70, what would this be except to make the great majority of the nation prospective pensioners of the state? With compulsory attendance at the state schools, with the state universities as the only entrance to public life and professions, when everyone for 3 years had to serve in the army, when so large a proportion of the population earned their livelihood in the railways, the post office, the customs, the administration, the state had already a power and influence which many besides the liberals regarded with alarm. What would it be when every working man looked forward to receiving, after his working days were over, a free gift from the government? Could not this power be used for political measures also? Could not it become a means for checking the freedom of opinions and even for interfering in the liberty of voting? He had to raise the money he wanted in another way, and in 1879 he began the great financial change that he had been meditating for 3 years. He threw all his vigor into overthrowing free trade and introducing a general system of protection. In this, he was only doing what a large number of his countrymen desired. The results of free trade had not been satisfactory. In 1876, there was a great crisis in the iron trade. Owing to overproduction, there was a great fall of prices in England, and Germany was being flooded with English goods sold below cost price. Many factories had to be closed, owners were ruined, and men thrown out of work. It happened that, by a law passed in 1873, the last duty on imported iron would cease on the 31st of December 1876. Many of the manufacturers and the large party in the Reichstag petitioned that the action of the law might at any rate be suspended. Free traders, however, still had the majority, for the greater portion of the national liberals belonged to that school, and the law was carried out. It was, however, apparent that not only the iron but other industries were threatened. The building of railways in Russia would bring about an increased importation of Russian corn and threaten the prosperity not only of the large proprietors but also of the peasants. It had always been the wise policy of the Prussian government to maintain and protect by legislation the peasants, who were considered the most important class in the state. Then the trade in Swedish wood threatened to interfere with the profits from the German forest, an industry so useful to the health of the country and the prosperity of the government. But if free trade would ensure the market for the natural products of the soil, it did not bring any compensating advantages by helping industry. Germany was flooded with English manufacturers, so that even the home market was endangered, and every year it became more apparent that foreign markets were being closed. The sanguine expectations of the free traders had not been realized. America, France, Russia had high tariffs. German manufactured goods were excluded from these countries. What could they look forward to in the future but the ruined peasantry and the crippling of the iron and weaving industries? I had the impression, said Bismarck, that on the free trade we were gradually bleeding to death. He was probably much influenced in his new policy by Lothar Bucher, one of his private secretaries, who was constantly with him at Varzin. Bucher, who had been an extreme radical, had in 1849 been compelled to fly from the country and had lived many years in England. In 1865, he had entered Bismarck's service. He had acquired a peculiar enmity to the Cobden Club and looked on that institution as the subtle instrument of a deep-laid plot to persuade other nations to adopt a policy which was entirely for the benefit of England. He drew attention to Cobden's words, "All we desire is the prosperity and greatness of England." We may in fact look on the Cobden Club and the principles it advocated from two points of view. Either they are, as Bucher maintained, simply English and their only result will be the prosperity of England, or they are merely one expression of a general form of thought which we know as liberalism. It was an attempt to create cosmopolitan institutions and to induce German politicians to take their economic doctrines from England, just as a few years before they had taken their political theories. In either case, these doctrines would be very distasteful to Bismarck, who disliked internationalism in finance as much as he did in constitutional law or socialist propaganda. Bismarck, in adopting protection, was influenced not by economic theory, but by the observation of facts. All nations, he said, which have protective duties enjoy a certain prosperity. What great advantages has America reached since it threatened to reduce duties twice, 5 times, 10 times as high as ours? England alone clung to free trade. And why? Because she had grown so strong under the old system of protection that she could now, as a Hercules, step down into the arena and challenge everyone to come into the lists. In the arena of commerce, England was the strongest. This was why he advocated free trade, for free trade was really a right of the most powerful. English interests were furthered under the veil of the magic word freedom, and by it, German enthusiasts for liberty were enticed to bring about the ruin and exploitation of their own country. End of section 27. Section 28 of Bismarck and the Foundation of the German Empire by James Headlam. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by S.S. Kim, Seoul, South Korea. Chapter 16. The Triple Alliance and Economic Reform, 1878 to 1887. Part 2. If we look at the matter purely from the economic point of view, it is indeed difficult to see what benefits Germany would gain from a policy of free trade. It was a poor country. If it was to maintain itself in the modern rivalry of nations, it must become rich. It could only become rich through manufactures, and manufacturers had no opportunity of growing unless they had some moderate protection from foreign competition. The effect of Bismarck's attention to finance was not limited to these great reforms. He directed the whole power of the government to the support of all forms of commercial enterprise and to the removal of all hindrances to the prosperity of the nation. To this task, he devoted himself with the same courage and determination which he had formerly shown in his diplomatic work. One essential element in the commercial reform was the improvement of the railways. Bismarck's attention had long been directed to the inconveniences which arose from the number of private companies, whose duty it was to regard the dividends of the shareholders rather than the interest of the public. The existence of a monopoly of this kind in private hands seemed to him indefensible. His attention was especially directed to the injury done to trade by the differential rate imposed on goods traffic. On many lines, it was the custom to charge lower rates on imported than on exported goods, and this naturally had a very bad effect on German manufacturers. He would have liked to remedy all these deficiencies by making all railways the property of the empire. We see again his masterful mind, which dislikes all compromise. In this, however, he was prevented by the opposition of the other states, who would not surrender the control of their own lines. In Prussia, he was able to carry out this policy of purchase of all private lines by the state. By the time he laid down the Ministry of Commerce, hardly any private companies remained. The acquisition of all the lines enabled the government greatly to improve the communication, to lower fares, and to introduce through communications. All this, of course, greatly added to the commercial enterprise and therefore the wealth of the country. He was now able to give degrees his encouragement and support to those Germans who for many years in countries beyond the sea had been attempting to lay the foundations for German commerce and even to acquire German colonies. Bismarck's attitude in this matter deserves careful attention. As early as 1874, he had been approached by German travelers to ask for the support of the government in a plan for acquiring German colonies in South Africa. They pointed out that here was a country fitted by its climate for European occupation. The present inhabitants of a large portion of it, the Boers, were anxious to establish their independence of England and would welcome German support. It was only necessary to acquire a port either at Santa Lucia or at Delaware Bay to receive a small subsidy from the government, and then private enterprise would divert the stream of German emigration from North America to South Africa. Bismarck, though he gave a courteous hearing to this proposal, could not promise them assistance, for, as he said, the political situation was not favorable. He must foresee that an attempt to carry out this or similar plans would inevitably bring about very serious difficulties with England, and he had always been accustomed to attach much importance to his good understanding with the English government. During the following years, however, the situation was much altered. First of all, great enterprise had been shown by the German merchants and adventurers in different parts of the world, especially in Africa and in the Pacific. They, in these difficulties which will always occur when white traders settle in half-civilized lands, applied for support to the German government. Bismarck, as he himself said, did not dare to refuse them this support. I approached the matter with some reluctance. I asked myself, how could I justify it if I said to these enterprising men, over whose courage, enthusiasm, and vigor I have been heartily pleased, that is all very well, but the German Empire is not strong enough. It would attract the ill will of other states. I have not the courage as Chancellor to declare to them this bankruptcy of the German nation for transmarine enterprises. It must, however, happen that wherever these German settlers went, they would be in the neighborhood of some English colony, and however friendly were the relations of the governments of the two powers, disputes must occur in the outlying parts of the earth. In the first years of the empire, Bismarck had hoped that German traders would find sufficient protection from the English authorities and anticipated their taking advantage of the full freedom of trade allowed in the British colonies. They would get all the advantages which would arise from establishing their own colonies, while the government would be spared any additional responsibility. He professed, however, to have learnt by experience from the difficulties which came after the annexation of the Fiji Islands by Great Britain, that this hope would not be fulfilled. He acknowledged the great friendliness of the Foreign Office, but complained that the Colonial Office regarded exclusively British interests. As a complaint coming from his mouth, this arouses some amusement. The Colonial Office expressed itself satisfied to have received from so high an authority a testimonial to its efficiency, which it had rarely gained from Englishmen. The real change in the policy of the empire must, however, be attributed not to any imaginary shortcomings of the English authorities. It was an inevitable result of the abandonment of the policy of free trade and of the active support which the government was now giving to all forms of commercial enterprise. It was shown, first of all, in the grant of subsidies to mail steamers, which enabled German trade and German travelers henceforward to be carried by German ships. Before, they had depended entirely on English and French lines. It was not till 1884 that the government saw its way to undertake protection of German colonies. They were enabled to do so by the great change which had taken place in the political situation. Up to this time, Germany was powerless to help or to injure England, but on the other hand, required English support. All this was changed by the occupation of Egypt. Here, England required a support on the continent against the indignation of France and the jealousy of Russia. This could only be found in Germany, and therefore a close approximation between the two countries was natural. Bismarck let it be known that England would find no support but rather opposition if she, on her side, attempted, as she so easily could have done, to impede German colonial enterprise. In his colonial policy, Bismarck refused to take the initiative. He refused also to undertake the direct responsibility for the government of their new possessions. He imitated the older English plan and left the government in the hands of private companies, who received the charter of incorporation. He avowedly was imitating the East India Company and the Hudson's Bay Company. The responsibility of the German government were limited to protection of their companies against the attack or interference by any other power, and a general control over their actions. In this way, it was possible to avoid calling on the Reichstag for any large sum or undertaking the responsibility of an extensive colonial establishment for which, at the time, they had neither men nor experience. Another reason against the direct annexation of foreign countries lay in the constitution of the empire. It would have been easier to annex fresh land to Prussia. This could have been done by the authority of the king. There was, however, no provision by which the Bundesrat would undertake this responsibility, and it probably could not be done even with the assent of the Reichstag, unless some changes were made in the constitution. It was, however, essential that the new acquisition should be German and not Prussian. All these changes were not introduced without much opposition. The progressives especially distinguished themselves by their prolonged refusal to assent even to the subsidies for German lines of steamers. In the Parliament of 1884, they were enabled often to throw out government proposals. It was at this time that the conflict between Bismarck and Richter reached its height. He complained, and justly complained, that the policy of the progressives was then, as always, negative. It is indeed strange to notice how we find reproduced in the Germany that same feeling which a few years before had in England nearly led to the loss of the colonies and the destruction of the empire. It is too soon even now to consider fully the result of this new policy. The introduction of protection had indeed, if we are to judge by appearances, brought about a great increase in the prosperity of the country. Whether the scheme for old age pensions will appease the discontent of the working men seems very doubtful. One thing, however, we must notice. The influence of the new policy is far greater than the immediate result of the actual laws passed. It has taught the Germans to look to the government not only as a means of protecting them against the attacks of other states, but to see in it a thoughtful, and I think we may say kindly, guardian of their interests. They know that every attempt of each individual to gain wealth or power for his country will be supported and protected by the government. They know that there is constant watchfulness as to dangers to life and health which arise from the conditions of modern civilization. In these laws, in fact, Bismarck, who deeply offended and irretrievably alienated the survivors of his own generation, won over and secured for himself and also for the government the complete loyalty of the rising generation. It might be supposed that this powerful action on the part of the state would interfere with private enterprise. The result shows that this is not the case. A watchful and provident government really acts as an incentive to each individual. Let us also recognize that Bismarck was acting exactly as in the old days every English government acted when the foreign policy was dictated by the interests of British trade and the home policy aimed at preserving, protecting, and assisting the different classes in the community. Bismarck has often been called a reactionary, and yet we find that by the social legislation he was the first statesman deliberately to apply himself to the problem which had been created by the alteration in the structure of society. Even if the solutions which he proposed do not prove in every case to have been the best, he undoubtedly foresaw what would be the chief occupation for the statesmen of the future. In these reforms he had, however, little help from the Reichstag. The liberals were bitterly opposed, the socialists skeptical and suspicious, the Catholics cool and unstable allies. During these years, the chronic quarrel between himself and Parliament broke out with renewed vigor. How bitterly did he deplore party spirit, the bane of German life, which seemed each year to gain ground. It has, he said, transferred itself to our modern public life and parliaments. The governments indeed stand together, but in the German Reichstag I do not find the guardian of liberty for which I had hoped. Party spirit has overrun us. This is which I accuse before God and history. If the great work of our people achieved between 1866 and 1870 fall into decay, and in this house we destroy by the pen what has been created by the sword. In future years it will perhaps be regarded as one of his chief claims that he refused to become a party leader. He saved Germany from a serious danger to which almost every other country in Europe which has attempted to adopt English institutions has fallen a victim, the sacrifice of national welfare to the integrity and power of a parliamentary fraction. His desire was a strong and determined government, zealously working for the benefit of all classes, quick to see and foresee present and future evil. He regarded not the personal wishes of individual, but looked only in each matter he undertook to its effect on the nation as a whole. I will accept help, he said, wherever I may get it. I care not to what party any man belongs. I have no intention of following a party policy. I used to do so when I was a young and angry member of a party, but it is impossible for a Prussian or German minister. Though the Constitution had been granted, he did not wish to surrender the oldest and best traditions of the Prussian monarchy. And even if the power of the king and emperor was limited and checked by two parliaments, it was still his duty, standing above all parties, to watch over the country as 100 years before his ancestors had done. His power, however, was checked by the parliament. Bismarck often sighed for a free hand. He longed to be able to carry out his reforms, complete and rounded, as they lay clear before him in his own brain. How often did he groan under all the delay, the compromise, the surrender which was imposed upon him, when, conscious as he was that he was only striving for the welfare of his country, he had to win over not only the king, not only his colleagues in the Prussian ministry, his subordinates who had much power to check and impede his actions, but above all, the parliaments. It was inevitable that his relation to them should often be one of conflict. It was their duty to submit to a searching criticism the proposals of the government and to amend or reject them, and let us confess that it was better they were there. The modifications they introduced in the bills he proposed were often improvements. Those they rejected were not always wise. The drafting of government bills was often badly done. The first proposals for the socialistic law, the original draft of many of its economic reforms, were all the better when they had been once rejected and were again brought forward in a modified form. More than this, we must confess that Bismarck did not possess that temperament which would make it wise to entrust him with absolute dictatorial power in internal matters. He attempted to apply to legislation habits he had learned in diplomacy. And it is curious to notice Bismarck's extreme caution in diplomacy, where he was a recognized master, and his rashness in legislation, where the ground was often new to him. In foreign affairs, a forced move may easily be withdrawn, a change of alliance quickly made. It often happens that speed is more important than wisdom. In internal affairs, it is different. There, delay is in itself of value. Moreover, forced legislation cannot be imposed with impunity. Laws cannot be imposed and repealed. Bismarck often complained of the conduct of the Reichstag. There were in it two parties, the Socialists and Center, closely organized, admirably disciplined, obedient to leaders who were in opposition by principle. They looked on the parliamentary campaign as a struggle for power, and they maintained the struggle with the persistency and success which had not been surpassed by any parliamentary opposition in any other country. Apart from them, the attitude of all parties was normally that of moderate criticism directed to the matter of the government proposal. There were, of course, often angry scenes. Bismarck himself did not spare his enemies, but we find no events which show violence beyond what is, if not legitimate, at least inevitable in all parliamentary assemblies. The main objects of the government were always attained. The military budgets were always passed, though once not until after a dissolution. In the contest with the clerical party and the socialists, the government had the full support of a large majority. Even in the hostile Reichstag of 1884, in which the socialists, clericals, and progressives together commanded the majority, a series of important laws were passed. Once, indeed, the majority in opposition to the government went beyond the limits of reason and honor when they refused a vote of £1,000 for an additional director in the Foreign Office. It was the expression of jealousy which had no justification in facts. At the time, the German Foreign Office was the best managed department in Europe. The labor imposed on the secretaries was excessive, and the nation could not help contrasting this vote with the fact that shortly before a large number of the members had voted that payment should be made to themselves. The nation could not help asking whether it would not gain more benefit from another £1,000 a year expended on the Foreign Office than from £50,000 a year for payment of members. Even this unfortunate action was remedied a few months later when the vote was passed in the same parliament by a majority of 20. Notwithstanding all their internal differences and the extreme party spirit which often prevailed, the Reichstag always showed determination in defending its own privileges. More than once, Bismarck attacked them in the most tender points. At one time, it was on the privileges of members and their freedom from arrest. Both during the struggle with the clericals and with the socialists, the claim was made to arrest members during the session for political utterances. When Berlin was subject to a state of siege, the president of the police claimed the right of expelling from the capital obnoxious socialist members. On these occasions, the government found itself confronted by the unanimous opposition of the whole House. In 1884, Bismarck proposed that the meetings of the Reichstag should be biennial and the budget voted for 2 years. The proposals were supported on the reasonable grounds that thereby inconvenience and press of work would be averted, which arose from meeting of the Prussian and German parliaments every winter. Few votes, however, could be obtained for a suggestion which seemed to cut away the most important privileges of parliament. Another of the great causes of friction between Bismarck and the parliament arose from the question as to freedom of debate. Both before 1866 and since that year, he made several attempts to introduce laws that members should be to some extent held responsible and under certain circumstances be brought before a court of law in consequence of what they had said from their places in parliaments. This was represented as an interference with freedom of speech and was bitterly resented. Bismarck, however, always professed, and I think truly, that he did not wish to control the members in their opposition to the government, but place some check on their personal attacks on individuals. A letter to one of his colleagues, written in 1883, is interesting. I have, he says, long learned the difficulties which educated people who had been well brought up have to overcome in order to meet the coarseness of our parliamentary club-fechter pugilist with the necessary amount of indifference, and to refuse them in one's own consciousness the undeserved honor of moral equality. The repeated and bitter struggles in which you have had to fight alone will have strengthened you in your feeling of contempt for opponents who are neither honorable enough nor deserve sufficient respect to be able to injure you. There was indeed a serious evil arising from the want of the feeling of responsibility in a parliamentary assembly which had no great and honorable traditions. He attempted to meet it by strengthening the authority of the House over its own members. The chairman did not possess any power of punishing breaches of decorum. Bismarck often contrasted this with the very great powers over their own members possessed by the British Houses of Parliament. He drew attention to the procedure by which, for instance, Mr. Plimsoll could be compelled to apologize for hasty words spoken in a moment of passion. It is strange that neither the Prussian nor the German Parliament consented to adopt rules which are really the necessary complement for the privileges of Parliament. The Germans were much disappointed by the constant quarrels and disputes which were so frequent in public life. They had hoped that with the unity of their country, a new period would begin. They found that, as before, the management of public affairs was disfigured by constant personal enmities and the struggles of parties. We must not, however, look on this as a bad sign. It is rather more profitable to observe that the new institutions were not affected or weakened by this friction. It was a good sign for the future that the new state held together as firmly as any old established monarchy, and that the most important question of policy could be discussed and decided without even raising any point which might be a danger to the permanence of the empire. Bismarck himself did much to put his relations with the Parliament on a new and better footing. Acting according to his general principle, he felt that the first thing to be done was to induce mutual confidence by unrestrained personal intercourse. The fact that he himself was not a member of the Parliament deprived him of those opportunities which an English minister enjoys. He therefore instituted in 1868 a parliamentary reception. During the session, generally one day each week, his house was opened to all members of the House. The invitations were largely accepted, especially by the members of the National Liberal and Conservative parties. Those who were opponents on principle, the Centre, the Progressives, and the Socialists generally stayed away. These receptions became the most marked feature in the political life of the capital, and they enabled many members to come under the personal charm of the Chancellor. What an event was it in the life of the young and unknown deputy from some obscure provincial town, when he found himself sitting perhaps at the same table as the Chancellor, drinking the beer which Bismarck had brought into honor at Berlin, and for which his house was celebrated, and listening, while with complete freedom from all arrogance or pomposity, his host talked as only he could. The weakest side of his administration lay in the readiness with which he had recourse to the criminal law to defend himself against political adversaries. He was indeed constantly subjected to attacks in the press, which were often unjust and sometimes unmeasured, but no man who takes part in public life is exempt from calumny. He was himself never slow to attack his opponents, both personally in the parliament and still more by the hired writers of the press. Nonetheless, to defend himself from attacks, he too often brought his opponents into the police court, and Bismarck beleidigung became a common offense. Even the editor of Kladderadatsch was once imprisoned. He must be held personally responsible, for no action could be instituted without his own signature to the charge. We see the same want of generosity in the use which he made of attempts or reputed attempts at assassination. In 1875, while he was at Kissingen, a young man shot at him. He stated that he had been led to do so owing to the attacks made on the Chancellor by the Catholic party. No attempt, however, was made to prove that he had any accomplices. It was not even suggested that he was carrying out the wishes of the party. It was one of those cases which will always occur in political struggles when a young and inexperienced man will be excited by political speeches to actions which no one would foresee and which would not be the natural result of the words to which he had listened. Nevertheless, Bismarck was not ashamed publicly in the Reichstag to taunt his opponents with the action and to declare that whether they would or not, their party was Kuhlmann's party. He clings to your coattails, he said. A similar event had happened a few years before, when a young man had been arrested on the charge that he intended to assassinate the Chancellor. No evidence in support of the charge was forthcoming, but the excuse was taken by the police for searching the house of one of the Catholic leaders with whom the accused had lived. No incriminating documents of any kind were found, but among the private papers was the correspondence between the leaders in the party of the center, dealing with questions of party organization and political tactics. The government used these private papers for political purposes and published one of them. The constant use of the police in political warfare belonged, of course, to the system he had inherited, but nonetheless it was to have been hoped that he would have been strong enough to put it aside. The government was now firmly established. It could afford to be generous. Had he definitely cut himself off from these bad traditions, he would have conferred on his country a blessing scarcely less than all the others. The opposition of the parties in the Reichstag to his policy and person did not represent the feelings of the country. As the years passed by and the new generation grew up, the admiration for his past achievements and for his character only increased. His 70th birthday, which he celebrated in 1885, was made the occasion for a great demonstration of regard, in which the whole nation joined. A national subscription was opened, and a present of 2 million marks was made to him. More than half of this was devoted to repurchasing that part of the estate at Schönhausen which had been sold when he was a young man. The rest he devoted to forming an institution for the help of teachers in higher schools. A few years before, the emperor had presented to him the Sachsenwald, a large portion of the royal domains in the Duchy of Lauenburg. He now purchased the neighboring estate of Friedrichsruh, so that he had a third country residence to which he could retire. It had a double advantage: its proximity to the great forest in which he loved to wander, and also to a railway, making it little more than an hour distant from Berlin. He was able, therefore, at Friedrichsruhe to continue his management affairs more easily than he could at Varzin. End of section 28. Section 29 of Bismarck and the Foundation of the German Empire by James Headlam. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by S.S. Kim, Seoul, South Korea. Chapter 27, Retirement and Death, 1887 to 1898. Part 1. Well was it for Germany that Bismarck had not allowed her to fall into the weak and vacillating hands of a parliamentary government. Peace has its dangers as well as war, and the rivalry of nations lays upon them a burden beneath which all but the strongest must succumb. The future was dark. Threatening clouds were gathering in the east and west. The hostility of Russia increased, and in France the Republic was wavering. A military adventurer had appeared who threatened to use the desire for revenge as a means for his personal advancement. Germany could no longer disregard French threats. Year by year, the French army had been increased, and in 1886, General Boulanger introduced a new law by which, in time of peace, over 500,000 men would be under arms. Russia had nearly 550,000 soldiers on the peace establishment, and against this, Germany only 430,000. They were no longer safe. The duty of the government was clear. In December 1886, they brought forward a law to raise the army to 470,000 men and keep it at that figure for 7 years. We have no desire for war, said Bismarck in defending the proposal. We belong, to use an expression of Prince Metternich, to the states whose appetite is satisfied. Under no circumstances shall you attack France. The stronger we are, the more improbable is war. But if France has any reason to believe that she is more powerful than me, then war is certain. It was, he said, no good for the House to assure the government of their patriotism and their readiness for sacrifice when the hour of danger arrived. They must be prepared beforehand. Wars are not soldiers, and speeches not battalions. The House, there was a majority of Catholics, Socialists, and Progressives throughout the bill. The government dissolved, and the country showed its confidence in Bismarck and Moltke. Conservatives and national liberals made a coalition. The Pope himself ordered the Catholics not to oppose the government. His support had been purchased by the partial repeal of a law expelling religious orders from Prussia, and the Emperor could celebrate his 90th birthday, which fell in March 1887, hopeful that the beneficent work of peace reform would continue. And yet, never was Bismarck's resource so needed as during the last year in which he was to serve his old master. First, a French spy was arrested on German soil. The French demanded his release, maintaining that German officers had violated the frontier. Unless one side gave way, war was inevitable. The French government, insecure as it was, could not venture to do so. Bismarck was strong enough to be lenient. The spy was released and peace was preserved. Then, on the other side, the passionate enmity of Russia burst out in language of unaccustomed violence. The national press demanded the dismissal of Bismarck or war. The Tsar passed through Germany on its way to Copenhagen, but ostentatiously avoided meeting the Emperor. The slide was so open that the worst predictions were justified. In November, on his return, he spent few hours in Berlin. Bismarck asked for an audience, and then he found that dispatches had been laid before the Tsar, which seemed to show that he, while avowedly supporting Russia in Bulgarian affairs, had really been undermining her influence. The dispatches were forged. We do not yet know who it was that hoped to profit by stirring up a war between the two great nations. We can well believe that Bismarck, in the excitement of the moment, spoke with an openness to which the Tsar was not accustomed. He succeeded, however, in bringing about a tolerable understanding. The Tsar assured him that he had no intention of going to war. He only desired peace. Bismarck did all that human ingenuity could preserve it. By the Triple Alliance, he had secured Germany against the attack of Russia. He now entered into a fresh and secret agreement with Russia, by which Germany agreed to protect her against an attack from Austria. He thereby hoped to be able to prevent the Tsar from looking to France for support against the Triple Alliance. It was policy of singular daring to enter into a defensive alliance with Russia against Austria, at the same time that he had another defensive alliance with Austria against Russia. To show that he had no intention of deserting his old ally, he caused the text of the treaty with Austria to be published. This need no longer be interpreted as a threat to Russia. Then, that Germany, if all else failed, might be able to stand on her own resources, another increase of the army was asked for. By the reorganization of the reserve, 500,000 men could be added to the army in time of war. This proposal was brought before the Reichstag, together with one for a loan of 28 million marks to purchase the munitions of war which would be required, and in defense of this, Bismarck made the last of his great speeches. It was not necessary to plead for the bill. He was confident of the patriotism of the House. His duty was to curb the nervous anxiety which recent events had produced. These proposals were not for war, but for peace. But they must indeed be prepared for war, for that was a danger that was never absent, and by a review of the last 40 years, he showed that scarcely a single year had gone by in which there had not been the probability of a great European conflict, a war of coalitions in which all the great states of Europe would be ranged on one side or the other. This danger was still present. It would never cease. Germany, now as before, must always be prepared, for the strength of Germany was the security of Europe. We must make greater exertions than other powers on account of our geographical position. We lie in the middle of Europe. We can be attacked on all sides. God has put us in a situation in which our neighbors will not allow us to fall into indolence or apathy. The pike in the European fish pond prevent us from becoming carp. It was not their fault if the old alliance with Russia had broken down. The alliance with Austria still continued. But above all, Germany must depend on her army, and then they could look boldly into the future. It will calm our citizens if they think that if we are attacked on two sides, we can put 1 million good soldiers on the frontier and in a few weeks support them by another 1 million. But let them not think that this terrible engine of war was a danger to the peace of Europe. In words which represent a profound truth, he said, it is just the strength at which we aim that makes us peaceful. That sounds paradoxical, but it is so. With the powerful engine into which we are forming the German army, one undertakes no offensive war. In truth, when the army was the nation, what statesman was there who would venture on war unless he were attacked? If I were to say to you, we are threatened by France and Russia, it is better for us to fight at once. An offensive war is more advantageous for us, and ask for credit of 100 millions. I do not know whether you would grant it. I hope not. And he concluded, it is not fear which makes us lovers of peace, but the consciousness of our own strength. We can be won by love and goodwill, but by them alone. We Germans fear God and nothing else in the world, and it is the fear of God which makes us seek peace and ensure it. These are words which will not be forgotten so long as the German tongue is spoken. Well, will it be if they are remembered in their entirety? They were the last message of the older generation to the new Germany which had arisen since the war, for already the shadow of death lay over the city. In the far south, the Crown Prince was sinking to his grave, and but a few weeks were to pass before Bismarck stood at the bedside of the dying emperor. He died on March 9, 1888, a few days before his 91st birthday, and with him passed the support on which Bismarck's power rested. He was not a great man, but he was an honorable, loyal, and courteous gentleman. He had not always understood the course of Bismarck's policy or approved the views which his minister adopted. The restraint he had imposed had often been inconvenient, and Bismarck had found much difficulty in overcoming the prejudices of his master. But it had nonetheless been a gain for Bismarck that he was compelled to explain and justify his action to men whom he never ceased to love and respect. How beneficial had been the controlling influence of his presence, the world was to learn by the events which followed his death. That had happened to which, for 25 years, all Bismarck's enemies had looked forward. The foundation on which his power rested was taken away. Men at once began to speculate on his fall. The noble presence of the Crown Prince, his cheerful and kindly manners, his known attachment to liberal ideas, his strong national feeling, the success with which he had borne himself on the uncongenial field of battle, all had made him the hope of the generation to which he belonged. Who was so well suited to solve the difficulties of internal policy with which Bismarck had struggled so long? Hopes never to be fulfilled. Absent from his father's deathbed, he returned to Berlin a crippled and dying man, and when a few weeks later his body was lowered into the grave, there were buried with him the hopes and aspirations of a whole generation. His early death was indeed a great misfortune for his country. Not that he would have fulfilled all the hopes of the party that would made him their leader. It is never wise to depend on the liberalism of a crown prince. When young and inexperienced, he had been in opposition to his father's government. But his father before him had, while heir to the throne, also held a similar position to his own brother. As crown prince, he had desired and had won popularity. He had even too sensitive to public opinion. His, however, was a character that required only responsibility to strengthen it. With the burden of sovereignty, he would, we may suppose, have shown a fixity of purpose which many of his admirers would hardly have expected of him, nor would he have been deficient in those qualities of a ruler which are the traditions of his family. He was not a man to surrender any of the prerogatives or authority of the crown. He had a stronger will than his father, and he would have made his will felt. His old enmity to Bismarck had almost ceased. It is not probable that, with the new emperor, the chancellor would long have held his position, but he would have been able to transfer the crown to a man who had learned wisdom by prolonged disappointment. How he would have governed is shown by the only act of authority which he had time to carry out. He would have done what was more important than giving a little more power to the parliament. He would at once have stopped that old and bad system which the Prussian government has always attempted to schoolmaster the people. During his short reign, he dismissed Herr von Puttkamer, the Minister of the Interior, a relative of Bismarck's wife, for interfering with the freedom of election. we may be sure that he would have allowed full freedom of speech, and that he would not have consented to govern by aid of police. Under him, there would not have been constant trials for Majestät-Beleidigung or Bismarck-Beleidigung. This he could have done without weakening the power of Crown or the authority of the government. Those who know Germany will believe that it was the one reform which was still required. The illness of the emperor made it desirable to avoid points of conflict. Both he and Bismarck knew that it was impossible during the few weeks that his life would be spared to execute so important a change as the resignation of the Chancellor would have been. On many points, there was a difference of opinion, but Bismarck did not unduly express his view, nor did he threaten to resign if his advice were not adopted. When, for instance, the emperor hesitated to give his assent to a law prolonging the period of parliament, Bismarck did not attempt to control his decision. When Herr Puttkamer was dismissed, Bismarck did not remonstrate against an act which was almost of the nature of a personal reprimand to himself. It was, however, different when the foreign policy of the empire was affected, for here Bismarck, as before, considered himself the trustee and guarantor of the security of Germany. An old project was now revived for bringing about a marriage between the Princess Victoria of Prussia and Prince Alexander of Battenberg. This had been suggested some years before, while the prince was still ruler of Bulgaria. At Bismarck's advice, the Emperor William had refused his consent to the marriage, partly for the reason that, according to the family law of the Hohenzollerns, a marriage between the Battenberger family would be a mésalliance. He was, however, even more strongly influenced by the effect this would have on the political situation of Europe. The foundation of Bismarck's policy was the maintenance of friendship with Russia. This old established alliance depended, however, on the personal goodwill of the Tsar, and not on the wishes of the Russian nation or any identity of interest between the two empires. A marriage between a Prussian princess and a man who was so bitterly hated by the Tsar, as was Prince Alexander, must have seriously injured the friendly relations which had existed between the two families since the year 1814. Bismarck believed that the happiness of the princess must be sacrificed to the interest of Germany, and the Emperor William, who, when a young man, had for similar reasons been required by his father to renounce the hand of the lady to whom he had been devotedly attached, agreed with him. Now, after the emperor's death, the project was revived. The Emperor Frederick wavered between his feelings as a father and his duty as a king. Bismarck suspected that the strong interest which the Empress displayed in the project was due not only to maternal affection, but also to the desire, which in her would be natural enough, to bring over the German Empire to the side of England in the Eastern question, so that England might have a stronger support in her perennial conflict with Russia. The matter, therefore, appeared to him as a conflict between the true interest of Germany and those old court influences which he so often had to oppose, by which the family relationship of the reigning sovereign were made to divert his attention from the single interests of his own country. He made it a question of confidence. He threatened to resign, as he so often did under similar circumstances. He let it be known through the press what was the cause, and in his opinion, the true interpretation of the conflict which influenced the court. In order to support his view, he called in the help of the Grand Duke of Baden, who, as the emperor's brother-in-law and one of the most experienced of the reigning princes, was the proper person to interfere in a matter which concerned both the private and the public life of the sovereign. The struggle, which threatened to become serious, was, however, allayed by the visit of the Queen of England to Germany. She, acting in German affairs with that strict regard to constitutional principle and that dislike of court intrigue that she always had observed in dealings with her own ministers, gave her support to Bismarck. The marriage did not take place. Frederick's reign lasted but 90 days, and his son ruled in his place. The new emperor belonged to the generation which had grown up since the war. He could not remember the old days of conflict. Like all of his generation, from his earliest years he had been accustomed to look on Bismarck with gratitude and admiration. In him, warm personal friendship was added to the general feeling of public regard. He had himself learned from Bismarck's own lips the principles of policy and the lessons of history. It might well seem that he would continue to lean for support on the old statesman. So he himself believed, but careful observers who saw his power of will and his restless activity foretold that he would not allow to Bismarck that complete freedom of action and almost absolute power which he had obtained during the later years of the old emperor. They foretold also that Bismarck would not be content with a position of less power, and there were many whether to watch for and foment the differences which must arise. End of section 29. Section 30 of Bismarck and the Foundation of the German Empire by James Headlam. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by S.S. Kim, Seoul, South Korea. Chapter 17. Retirement and Death, 1887 to 1898. Part 2. In the first month of the new reign, some of Bismarck's old enemies attempted to undermine his influence by spreading reports of his differences with the Emperor Frederick, and Professor Gefkin even went so far as to publish from the manuscript some of the most confidential portions of the Emperor's diary in order to show that but for him Bismarck would not have created the new empire. The attempt failed, for, rightly read, the passages which were to injure Bismarck's reputation only served to show how much greater than men thought had been the difficulties with which he had had to contend and the wisdom with which he had to deal with them. From the very beginning, there were differences of opinion. The old and the new did not think or feel alike. Bismarck looked with disapproval on the constant journeys of the emperor. He feared that he was compromising his dignity. Moltke and others of the older generation retired from the posts they filled. Bismarck, with growing misgivings, stayed on. His promises to his old master, his love of power, his distrust of the capacity of others, all made it hard for him to withdraw when he still might have done so with dignity. We cannot doubt that his presence was irksome to his master. His influence and authority were too great. Before them, even the majesty of the throne was dimmed. The minister was a greater man than the sovereign. If we are to understand what happened, we must remember how exceptional was the position which Bismarck now occupied. He had repeatedly defied the power of Parliament and shown that he was superior to the Reichstag. There were none among his colleagues who could approach him in age or experience. The Prussian ministers were as much his nominees as were the officials of the empire. He himself was chancellor, minister-president, foreign minister, and minister of trade. His son was at the head of the foreign office and was used for the more important diplomatic missions. His cousin was minister of the interior. In the management of the most critical affairs, he depended upon the assistance of his own family and secretaries. He had twice been able, against the will of his colleagues, to reverse the whole policy of the state. The government was in his hands, and men had learned to look to him rather than to the emperor. Was it to be expected that a young man, ambitious, full of spirit and self-confidence, who had learned from Bismarck himself a high regard for his monarchical duties, would acquiesce in this system? Nay, more, was it right that he should? It was a fitting conclusion to his career that the man who had restored the monarchical character of the Prussian state should himself show that before the will of the king, he, as every other subject, must bow. Bismarck had spent the winter of 1889 at Friedrichsruhe. When he returned to Berlin at the end of January, he found that his influence and authority had been undermined. Not only was the emperor influenced by other advisers, but even the ministry showed an independence to which he was not accustomed. The chief causes of difference arose regarding the prolongation of the law against the socialists. This expired in 1890, and it was proposed to bring in a bill making it permanent. Bismarck wished even more than this to intensify the stringency of its provisions. Apparently, the emperor did not believe that this was necessary. He hoped that it would be possible to remove the disaffection of the working men by remedial measures, and in order to discuss this, he summoned the European Congress, which would meet in Berlin. Here, then, there was a fundamental difference of opinion between the King of Prussia and his minister. The result was that Bismarck did not consider himself able to defend the socialist law before the Reichstag, for he could not any longer give full expression to his own views. The parliament was left without direction from the government, and eventually a coalition between the extreme conservatives, the radicals, and the socialists rejected the bill altogether. A bitterly contested general election followed, in which the name and the new policy of the emperor were freely used, and it resulted in a majority opposed to the parties who were accustomed to support Bismarck. These events made it obvious that on matters of internal policy, a permanent agreement between the emperor and the chancellor was impossible. It seems that Bismarck therefore offered to resign his post as minister-president, maintaining only the general control of foreign affairs. But this proposition did not meet with the approval of the emperor. There were, however, other grounds of difference connected even with foreign affairs. The emperor was drawing closer to England and thereby separating from Russia. By the middle of March, matters had come to a crisis. The actual cause for the final difference was an important matter of constitutional principle. Bismarck found that the emperor had on several occasions discussed questions of administration with some of his colleagues without informing him. Moreover, important projects of law had been devised without his knowledge. He therefore drew the attention of the emperor to the principle of the German and Prussian constitutions. By the German constitution, as we have seen, the chancellor was responsible for all acts of the ministers and secretaries of states, who held office as his deputies and subordinates. He therefore claimed that he could require to be consulted on every matter of any importance which concerned any of these departments. The same right as regards Prussian affairs had been explicitly secured to the minister-president by a cabinet order of 1852, which was passed in order to give to the president that complete control which was necessary if he was to be responsible for the whole policy of the government. The emperor answered by a command that he should draw up a new order reversing this decree. This Bismarck refused to do. The emperor repeated his instructions. It was a fundamental point on which no compromise was possible. The emperor proposed to take away from the chancellor that supreme position he had so long enjoyed, to recall into his own hands that immediate control of all departments which in old days the kings of Prussia had exercised, and, as Bismarck said, to be on his prime minister. In this degradation of his position, Bismarck would not acquiesce. He had no alternative but to resign. The final separation between these two men, each so self-willed and confident in his own strength, was not to be completed by ceremonious discussions on constitutional forms. It was during an audience at the castle that the emperor had explained his views, Bismarck his objections. The emperor insisted that his will must be carried out, if not by Bismarck, then by another. "Then I am to understand, your Majesty," said Bismarck, speaking in English, "that I am in your way?" "Yes," was the answer. This was enough. He took his leave and returned home to draw up the formal document in which he tendered his resignation. This, which was to be the conclusion of his public life, had to be composed with care. He did not intend to be hurried, but the emperor was impatient, and his impatience was increased when he was informed that Windthorst, the leader of the Centre, had called on Bismarck at his residence. He feared lest there was some intrigue, and that Bismarck proposed to secure his position by an alliance with the parliamentary opposition. He sent an urgent verbal message requiring the resignation immediately, a command with which Bismarck was not likely to comply. Early next morning, the emperor drove round himself to his house, and Bismarck was summoned from his bed to meet the angry sovereign. The emperor asked what had taken place at the interview with Windthorst, and stated that ministers were not to enter on political discussions with parliamentary leaders without his permission. Bismarck denied that there had been any political discussion, and answered that he could not allow any supervision over the guests he chose to receive in his private house. "Not if I order it as your sovereign?" asked the emperor. "No, the commands of my king cease in my wife's drawing-room," answered Bismarck. The emperor had forgotten that Bismarck was a gentleman before he was a minister, and that a Prussian nobleman could not be treated like a Russian boyar. No reconciliation or accommodation was now possible. The emperor did all he could to make it appear that the resignation was voluntary and friendly. He conferred on the retiring chancellor the highest honors. He raised him to the rank of field marshal, and created him Duke of Lauenburg, and publicly stated his intention of presenting him with a copy of his own portrait. As a soldier, Bismarck obediently accepted the military honor. The new title he requested to be allowed not to use. He had never been asked whether he desired it. No outward honors could recompense him for the affront he had received. What profited it him that the princes and people of Germany joined in unanimous expression of affection and esteem, that he could scarcely set foot outside his house for the enthusiastic crowd who cheered and followed him through the streets of Berlin? For 24 years he had been Prussian minister, and now he was told he was in the way. His successor was already in office. He was himself driven in haste from the house which so long had been his home. A final visit to the princes of the royal house, a last audience with the emperor, a hasty leave-taking from his friends and colleagues, and then the last farewell, when in the early morning he drove to Charlottenburg and alone went down into the mausoleum where his old master slept, to lay a rose upon his tomb. The rest he had so often longed for had come, but it was too late. 40 years he had passed in public life, and he could not now take up again the interests and occupations of his youth. Agriculture had no more charms for him. He was too infirm for sport. He could not, like his father, pass his old age in the busy indolence of a country gentleman's life, nor could he, as some statesmen have done, soothe his declining years by harmless and amiable literary dilettantism. His religion was not of that complexion that he could find in contemplation and in preparation for another life consolation for the trials of this one. At 75 years of age, his intellect was as vigorous and his energy as unexhausted as they had been 20 years before. His health was improved, for he had found in Dr. Schwenninger a physician who was not only able to treat his complaints, but could also compel his patient to obey his orders. He still felt within himself full power to continue his public work, and now he was relegated to impotence and obscurity. Whether in Varzin or Friedrichsruhe, his eyes were always fixed on Berlin. He saw the state which he had made and which he loved as a father subjected to the experiment of young and inexperienced control. He saw overthrown that carefully planned system by which the peace of Europe was made to depend upon the prosperity of Germany. Changes were made in the working of that constitution which it seemed presumption for anyone but him to touch. His policy was deserted. His old enemies were taken into favor. Can you wonder that he could not restrain his impatience? He felt like a man who sees his heir ruling in his own house during his lifetime, cutting down his woods and dismissing his old servants, or as if he saw a careless and clumsy rider mounted on his favorite horse. From all parts of Germany, deputations from towns and newspaper writers came to visit him. He received them with his customary courtesy and spoke with his usual frankness. He did not disguise his chagrin. He had, he said, not been treated with the consideration which he deserved. He had never been accustomed to hide his feelings or to disguise his opinions. Nothing that his successors did seemed to him good. They made a treaty with England for the arrangement of conflicting questions in Africa. Men looked to Bismarck to hear what he would say before they formed their opinion. I would never have signed the treaty, he declared. He quickly drifted into formal opposition to the government. He even made arrangements with one of the Hamburg papers that it should represent his opinions. He seemed to have forgotten his own principle that, in foreign affairs at least, an opposition to the policy of the government should not be permitted. He claimed the privilege which, as minister, he would never have allowed to another. He defied the governments. They shall not silence me, he said. It seemed as though he was determined to undo the work of his life. Under the pretext that he was attacking the policy of the ministers, he was undermining the loyalty of the people, for few could doubt that it was the emperor at whom the criticisms were aimed. In his isolation and retirement, the old uncompromising spirit of his ancestors once more awoke in him. He had been loyal to the crown, who more so, but his loyalty had limits. His long service had been one of personal and voluntary affection. He was not a valet, that his service could be handed on from generation to generation among the assets of the crown. After all, he would ask, who are these Hohenzollerns? My family is as good as theirs. We have been here longer than they have. Like his ancestors, who stood out against the rule of the great elector, he was putting personal feelings above public duty. Even if the action of the new government was not always wise, he himself had made Germany strong enough to support, for a few years, a weak ministry. More than this, He was attempting to destroy the confidence of the people in the moral justice and necessity of the measures by which he had founded the empire. They had always been taught that in 1870 their country had been the object of a treacherous and unprovoked attack. Bismarck, who was always living over again the great scenes in which he had been the leading actor, boasted that but for him there would never have been a war with France. He referred to the alteration in the Ems telegram, which we have already narrated, and the government was forced to publish the original documents. The conclusions drawn from these disclosures and others which followed were exaggerated, but the naive and simple belief of the people was irretrievably destroyed. Where they had been taught to see the will of God, they found only the machinations of the minister. In a country where patriotism had already taken the place of religion, the last illusion had been dispelled. Almost the last barrier was broken down, which stood between the nation and moral skepticism. Bismarck's criticism was very embarrassing to the government. By injuring the reputation of the ministry, he impaired the influence of the nation. It was difficult to keep silence and ignore the attack, but the attempts at defense were awkward and unwise. General Caprivi attempted to defend the treaty with England by reading out confidential minutes addressed by Bismarck to the Secretary of the Minister for Foreign Affairs, in which he had written that the friendship of England and the support of Lord Salisbury were more important than Zanzibar or the whole of Africa. He addressed a circular dispatch to Prussian envoys to inform them that the utterances of Prince Bismarck were without any actual importance, as he was now only a private man. This only made matters worse, for the substance of the dispatch quickly became known. Another instance of the lax control over important state documents, which we so often notice in dealing with German affairs, and only increased the bitterness of Bismarck, which was shared by his friends and supporters. For more than 2 years, the miserable quarrel continued. Bismarck was now the public and avowed enemy of the court and the ministry. Moltke died, and he alone of the great men of the country was absent from the funeral ceremony, but in his very absence he overshadowed all who were there. His public popularity only increased. In 1892, he traveled across Germany to visit Vienna for his son's wedding. His journey was a triumphal progress, and the welcome was warmest in the states of the south, in Saxony and Bavaria. The German government, however, found it necessary to instruct their ambassador not to be present at the wedding and to take no notice of the prince. He was not even granted an audience by the Austrian emperor. It was held necessary also to publish the circular to which I have already referred, and thereby officially to recognize the enmity. The scandal of the quarrel became a great injury to the government of the country. A serious illness of Bismarck caused apprehension that he might die while still unreconciled. The emperor took the opportunity and by a kindly message opened the way to an apparent reconciliation. Then a change of ministry took place. General Caprivi was made the scapegoat for the failure of the new administration and retired into private life, too loyal even to attempt to justify or defend the acts for which he had been made responsible. The new chancellor, Prince Hohenlohe, was a friend and former colleague of Bismarck and had in old days been leader of the National Party in Bavaria. When Bismarck's 80th birthday was celebrated, the emperor was present, and once more Bismarck went to Berlin to visit his sovereign. We may be allowed to believe that the reconciliation was not deep. We know that he did not cease to contrast the new marks of royal favor with the kindly courtesy of his old master, who had known so well how to allow the king to be forgotten in the friend. As the years went on, he became even more lonely. His wife was dead, and his brother. Solitude, the curse of greatness, had fallen on him. He had no friends, for we cannot tell by that name the man so inferior to himself by whom he was surrounded, men who did not scruple to betray his confidence and make a market of his infirmities. With difficulty could he bring himself even to systematic work on the memoirs he proposed to leave. Old age set its mark on him. His beard had become white. He could no longer, as in former days, ride and walk through the woods near his house. His interest in public affairs never flagged, and especially he watched with unceasing vigilance every move in the diplomatic world. His mind and spirit were still unbroken when a sudden return of his old malady overtook him, and on the last day of July 1898 he died at Friedrichsruhe. He lies buried not among his ancestors and kinsfolk near the old house at Schönhausen, nor in the imperial city where his work had been done, but in a solitary tomb at Friedrichsruhe, to which, with scanty state and hasty ceremony, his body had been borne. End of section 30. End of Bismarck and the Foundation of the German Empire by James Headlam.